The proceeding will start shortly. 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 The proceeding will start shortly.
Okay, I better get started there.
Order. Just before we start, I should point out that the Speaker had asked me to say that members who are able to bob and wish to speak during the debate should bob. If you obviously can't, we'll take that into account. I should also say there's about 13 backbenchers down on the list to speak in this debate. I know it's about 3 hours, but that probably means we may have to impose a time limit, and at the moment, as guidance, I'd say you might want to look for around 7 minutes or something like that, given there's likely to be some interventions. Okay, I call Martin Day to move the motion.
Here.
Thank you. I beg to move that this House has considered E-petition 628226 relating to the impact of the UK's exit from the European Union. It is, as always, a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today, Mr McCabe. This petition had, as at 11 a.m. today, attracted over 178,000 signatories. The number was changing by the minute, so it will be even higher now, and I would like to highlight that it remains open until the 18th of May, and I would urge anyone who agrees with the premise of the petition to add to the significant support it already has received. I am delighted to be leading this debate, not least because I wholeheartedly agree with the grounds for the petition and the petitioner's request, both of which state the benefits that were promised if the UK exited the European Union have not been delivered, so we call upon the government to hold a public inquiry to assess the impact that Brexit has had on this country and its citizens. It is time that the people of this country were told the truth about Brexit good or bad, we deserve to know how Brexit is impacting on trade, the economy, opportunities for young people, and how it has affected the rights of individuals. This can only be done by an independent public inquiry, free from ideology and the opinions of vested interests. Now, I had the pleasure of meeting with Peter Peckman, the man who started the petition last week. As an elected member of the European Movement's National Council and the manager of one of its local branches, Leeds for Europe, Peter is a passionate pro-European campaigner, and I'm delighted that he's been able to join us here today. I want to thank Peter and Leeds for Europe for their petition urging the UK Government to hold a public inquiry into the impact of Brexit, along with everyone who signed it, because it is these actions that have brought us here today for what I'm sure will be a very informative debate. Concerns have been raised that there has been no impact assessment carried out to assess the damage that Brexit has created, despite the Chairman of the Office of Budget Responsibility, OBR, saying in the long term it is the case that Brexit has a bigger impact than the pandemic.
Would he make an intervention?
Yes, certainly.
The Honourable is making a very good start to this important debate. And would he agree with me that one of the sectors worst affected is the creative sector, and that many musicians across the UK have been in touch with us as their representatives to say how they've been negatively affected by the agreement or the lack of agreements between countries, and I do hope that he and others will refer to that in his speech.
Martin Day.
Thank the Honourable Member for that point. It's a very good point, well made, and I think the problem we have with this debate is that there are so many areas that have been adversely affected that even with a best part of 20 minutes I will be struggling to touch on them all, but I look forward to the other members extrapolating from the points we start from. A public inquiry has, however, been set up into the UK's pandemic response, so it is reasonable, and I would suggest sensible, that one is also held into the impact of Brexit. The public have a right to know. Putting aside that support for Brexit is at its lowest since the referendum, the impact that leaving the EU has had on the UK needs to become common knowledge. We need to know where we are before we can plot our way forward to where we want to be. Yes, certainly.
Thank the Honourable Member for giving way. Some of those who felt the impact of Brexit the keenest are ones who were not old enough to vote. Children and young people, whether it's loss of access to schemes like Erasmus or school children stuck for many, many hours on coaches, as we saw over the Easter holidays at Dover, when we then had Conservative ministers telling us it had absolutely nothing to do with Brexit. And correspondingly, the Tourism Alliance has told us that the number of school children coming from European Union countries on school trips has halved because of the bureaucracy around group visas, and you can't travel without a passport. You used to be able to travel on an ID card. Does he agree with me that children and young people have fared the worst under this, when and many people were not aware of that when this went through?
Martin Day.
Thank the Honourable Member for a point. I do indeed agree with her. I think young people have lost the most. However, hopefully we can regain some of that in the future for them. Put simply, can we make Brexit work? Well, I very much doubt it. But can we move on without knowing what the foundation is? And the UK Government opened its response to the petitioners by saying the UK's departure from the EU was a democratic choice. For that reason, at the outset of this debate, I think it would be remiss of me if I did not respectively point out that 62% of those who voted in Scotland did not want to leave the EU, with every Scottish council returning a Remain majority, and that just under 56% of those who voted in Northern Ireland did not want to leave the EU either. It will come... Yes, certainly.
Allowing me to speak, but does he agree with me that transparency is the key to all good governance, and without knowing what the impact is of leaving the European Union, we will never be able to resolve the issues that we have at this moment in time?
Thank the Honourable Member. I think that's a very good point, and one which I will be making as well in the debate. It will come as no surprise to anyone that, as a citizen of one of those nations I just mentioned, that these figures do not seem very democratic to me. Now, it's not my place to comment on the Northern Ireland situation, particularly... I'm sure you will. Particularly pertaining to the added complexities of what was the Northern Ireland Protocol. However, I can say in truth that the whole Brexit saga lays bare why Westminster is, in my opinion, unfit to govern in Scotland's interests. Hear, hear. Indeed, it not only has the Brexit debacle blown apart the case for Westminster control, but the ensuing debate has shown beyond doubt that the two major Westminster parties are committed to the damage that leaving the EU is having on trade and economy across the UK. Yes, just one moment. As well as the opportunities for our young people and the rights of individuals.
Great giving way, and I apologise for jumping in on him quite so fast, but he's making lots of really important points. Does he agree with me that one of the most valuable features of a democracy is that it has the potential for error correction, and that you can therefore take into account that if people's minds have changed, as is increasingly the case with Brexit, then the only logical thing to do is to actually change the decision that has caused people to change their minds?
It's a very good point. In a democracy, people always have the right to change their mind, and that is something we should bear with us at all times. But before moving on to just some of the evidence of how Brexit is negatively impacting on these issues, I want to mention that the UK government's response also said the UK EU institutions are functioning as intended. Now, if that is the case, and considering the democratic will of the people of Northern Ireland was not met, it begs a question as to why it took so long for the UK EU institutions to reach agreement on the Windsor Framework. This breakthrough was surely not intended to take nearly 7 years. It is, of course, disappointing that a similar deal to Northern Ireland has not been afforded to Scotland. But that is not for discussion here. I'm sure we can have fun with that issue in months to come. However, given the length of time it took to negotiate such a critical agreement, can the Minister tell us what progress has been made on negotiating re-entry to European projects that all four nations will remove from, such as Horizon Europe, Copernicus, Euratom, the European Arrest Warrant, and access to Europol and Schengen information systems? It would be helpful if the Minister could also take this opportunity to explain why both the European Scrutiny Committee and the European Affairs Committee are currently holding inquiries into the new UK-EU relationship, and perhaps give us an indication of when we can expect to see these findings published to hopefully evidence the UK government's claim that the UK-EU institutions are indeed functioning as intended. Moving on to how Brexit is affecting trade and the economy, the Trade Secretary recently announced that the UK had reached agreement to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, sometimes referred to under the acronym CPTPP, or otherwise known as the Pacific Rim Trade Deal, which will allow zero tariffs for 99% of goods exported to the bloc. Although this agreement has not yet been signed, in her excitement, the Trade Secretary claimed it would open up our economy. Good news, you would think. However, in the course of this announcement, she also said we should not keep talking about Brexit. Well, today's debate might disappoint her, as it shows Brexit remains a live political issue, and I align... Yes, just let me finish the sentence and I will happily do so. A live political issue, and I align with the opinion of the petitioners that it will continue to be at least until the facts are known, and probably for some time to come afterwards. I'll happily give way to the honourable member.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. And just on the point of Brexit being in the minds of everyone, in my constituency of Battersea, this still remains an issue. For them, Brexit really has been an unmitigated disaster. Our economy is not growing, our rights and protections are now being infringed, and more importantly, Britain's standing in the world is also a challenge. I've called and asked on the government to produce a cumulative impact assessment on the impact of Brexit. So does he agree with me, as part of any public inquiry, it really must look at the cumulative impact that Brexit is having on our constituents?
I thank the honourable member. I'm happy to agree with that. The more I learn, the more I realise there is no such thing as a good Brexit, and I think we're all seeing that very clearly. The Trade Secretary's reason for saying what she did could be because, according to the UK government's own scoping assessment, the shiny new CPTPP trade bloc deal will only bring 0.08% increase in GDP over a lengthy 15 years. with the House of Commons Library reporting that the economic benefits of the CPTPP membership appear to be small. It falls well short. Yeah.
I'm very grateful for giving way. He mentions the 0.08% boost to GDP promised by access to the CPTPP. But surely, in all honesty, now the time has come, for the sake of our economy, to stop burying our heads in the sand. We can't just multiply excuses. We've got to face the reality that Brexit is part of the problem. And that with that, from my party's point of view, we should, of course, be looking to move towards rejoining the single market. Yeah. But the first part of this is to recognise that there are multiple causes, and Brexit is a critical one of them.
I thank the honourable member for that intervention. It's fair to say that the economic impact of Brexit falls well short of the benefits that the UK enjoyed with EU membership, the withdrawal from which the OBR says expects to reduce the overall trade intensity of the UK economy by 15% in the long term. And comparative to remaining in the EU, the latest OBR's Brexit analysis assumes that the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which sets the terms of the post-Brexit trading relationship between the UK and EU, will reduce the potential productivity of the UK economy by 4%, largely due to the increase in non-tariff barriers. In rebutting these figures during the CPTPP announcement, the Trade Secretary pointed out that the OBR's forecasting was speculative. However, the OBR's economic and fiscal outlook from last month highlighted that it had been reviewing and refining its assumptions about the economic impact of Brexit as new evidence has arrived, and that 2 years into the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the trends in the UK trade volumes remained consistent with its assumptions. Additionally, the OBR forecasts stem from outturned data that is published by the Office for National Statistics. The latest data from 2022's third quarter suggesting that the UK trade volumes remain 3% below their 2019 level, whilst there has been an average increase of 5.5% across other G7 countries. Similarly, trade intensity is 2.6% lower than its pre-pandemic level in the UK, yet it is 3.6% higher in the rest of the G7. A recent study also estimates that UK goods trade was 7% lower in June 2022 than it would have been if we were still in the EU. All in all, in terms of trading, the Pacific Rim trade deal, along with the already signed agreements with Australia and New Zealand, which have yet to come into force, have limited positive economic impact to compensate for what we have lost due to this UK government pushing through a hard Brexit deal that is outside of the EU single market and customs union. In December 2021, the National Office predicted the macroeconomic benefits of free trade agreement or FTA negotiations that were underway by the UK government at that time would only increase the UK's GDP by between 0.33% at best and 0.17% at worst after 15 years. From those projections, the USA was the biggest potential FTA partner. However, although negotiations started nearly 3 years ago, there is no trade agreement with the USA, and neither is one expected anytime soon. Therefore, the modesty of the relatively modest economic benefits that were projected from the secured and proposed agreements by the Department for International Trade has further decreased. Compare this to where we were, part of the second largest and most integrated world trading blocs that also happens to lead the way in global standards and regulations. Maybe the Prime Minister's idea about mandatory masks for everyone up to the age of 18 holds some credence after all, as these sums certainly don't add up. The Pacific Rim trade deal has also wider negative impacts, such as its inclusion of investor-state dispute settlement clauses, which I am totally against, as well as environmental costs. For example, the UK government's own analysis stated that joining CPTPP is estimated to increase the UK's domestic greenhouse gas emissions. Now, this complies with the UK, how this complies with the UK government's net zero ambitions escapes me. Perhaps the Minister can enlighten us on that front too. Like the Pacific Rim trade deal, Brexit is causing damage on multiple levels. but I will try to confine my remarks to the specific issues that the petition mentions and move on to how Brexit is impacting on opportunities for young people and the rights of individuals. Although before doing so, let me point out the obvious. The damaging impact of Brexit on trade and the economy undoubtedly has a ripple effects on opportunities and rights. That said, I will start with the removal of the right to free movement, and not just for work purposes, which puts barriers in place for both the UK and EU citizens, as well as caused workforce shortages in key sectors, including the crucial health and care sector, but for the simple matter of travel, which is now much less straightforward and flexible. We have only to look back a couple of weeks to see the delays at Dover over the Easter break that were caused by new passport stamping requirements, and we can look forward to worse delays to come when the EU's post-Brexit entry-exit system, EES, comes into effect next year. This new border control for non-EU travellers, which Brexit has made us, has been described as anticipated chaos, another Brexit benefit for us all to look forward to. And delays at customs are also a major headache for manufacturers. 31% predicting that due to new trading rules, customs delays will be the biggest risk to their company's competitiveness in 2023. And 36% of small and medium-sized businesses are still struggling with the new customs procedures and paperwork. And then there are privacy rights, which the EU's General Data Protection Regulations have thus far served us well in protecting our personal data. To replace these, the Science Secretary has recently put forward the new Data Protection and Digital Information No. 2 bill to supersede its predecessor that was repeatedly delayed. However, I have serious concerns that this will firstly erode the high standards of data protection rights that UK citizens held as part of the EU GDPR, and secondly, further negatively impact any review of UK-EU trade deal if it fails to protect EU citizens. I want to see a commitment to robust data privacy protections and world-beating data protection regulations being maintained. However, the bill's second reading last week, my honourable friend, the member for Glasgow North West, put on record that the Open Rights Group has said with regards to how this piece of post-Brexit legislation will affect individuals' rights, and I quote, "The government has an opportunity to strengthen the UK's data protection regime post-Brexit. However, it is instead setting the country on a dangerous path that undermines trust, further economic instability and erodes fundamental rights." Back in 2016, the Vote Leave campaign described EU regulations as excessive red tape. But like it or not, regulation is essential, not just for the EU single market to function, but also to protect workers. Moreover, the UK government's retained EU law revocation and reform bill, which was brought forward despite not knowing exactly how many regulations it would affect, will enable the UK government to abandon vital legislation that has protected people's rights for almost 50 years. During committee stage in the Commons, my honourable friend, the member for Argyll and Bute, tabled many amendments that targeted multiple issues in this bill, including around workers' rights, food standards, consumer safety and the uncertainty facing businesses. It is frankly a disgrace that these concerns were ignored by the UK government and that all SNP amendments were voted down by Conservative MPs. Regarding the impact of Brexit on opportunities for young people, it is no exaggeration to say it has removed their access to a European, if not global, labour market. Instead of prioritising young people, enhancing their opportunities and widening access to positive destinations to ensure they get the best possible start in life, Brexit has stolen these prospects for success. Yes, certainly.
Would he agree with me that the particular impact on school trips has been enormous and that has a knock-on effect, not just on our local economy here in London and across the UK, but also tends to narrow the horizons in terms of friendship forming and all those important intangible benefits of doing school trips abroad?
No, I would agree wholeheartedly with that. And as a person who's benefited from town twinning, sister cities deals over the course of my life, it also weakens our soft power and our influence in other countries as well. On top of all that, removing freedom of movement means that our young people can no longer study in EU countries without a visa, never mind gain experience of travelling or working in Europe. Additionally, the UK Government's decision to leave the Erasmus programme and all its related benefits have not been replaced by its UK replacement, the Turing Scheme. Likewise, there has been a sharp drop in the number of new EU students enrolling in universities across the UK. Indeed, it was reported in January that the numbers had more than halved, with Brexit seen as the primary deterrent. Universities UK said that the increase in students from outside the EU had failed to offset the exodus of EU students at undergraduate level, weakening financial stability in some third-level education and reducing diversity across some subject areas. The head of Global Mobility Policy at Universities UK said that the figures show very clearly the impact of the sort of loss of freedom of movement. And this is impacting on research talent for the UK, with my honourable friend, the member for Midlothian, raising concerns in a debate just last week about research and development funding and Horizon Europe, pointing out that since 2014, Scottish and UK universities have lost almost £1 billion in structural EU funds for research. The manufacturers' organisation Make UK has advised Horizon Europe is a key area of funding for innovation in the UK manufacturing sector and will be important for growth in areas such as advanced manufacturing and digital processes. Yet, due to discussions still ongoing, UK-based researchers have been unable to access Horizon Europe funds. I conclude my opening remarks by saying that nearly 7 years on from the Brexit referendum, the UK public are still waiting for the elusive Brexit benefits that were promised. Having raised just some of the areas where leaving the EU has impacted on the UK, it seems to me that the benefits of Brexit are pure fantasy. The economic fallout from Brexit is stark, and it has been made starker by the current cost of living crisis that has been inflicted on households up and down the country. Now, from my perspective, Brexit has been an unmitigated disaster, politically, economically and socially, for Scotland and for the rest of the UK. The UK government, of course, has a means to refute this. When major events occur, public inquiries can be held into matters of public concern, to establish facts, to learn lessons so that mistakes are not repeated, to restore public confidence and to determine accountability. And I don't think anyone here can deny that Brexit was a major event. And this petition shows that it's still a matter of public concern and that we will not stop talking about it, despite the Trade Secretary's request. I'm sure I've barely scratched the surface of today's matter. I look forward to hearing the other speakers in the debate and particularly hearing the Minister responding to the points which are made. I'm sure we are all interested to hear his points and how the government does not believe the UK's departure from the EU is an opportunity subject for a public inquiry, because I think it clearly is. Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you. The question is that this House has considered E-petition 628226 relating to the impact of the UK's exit from the European Union. I think, given the number of people who want to speak, we are going to opt for a time limit. I'm going to start with 8 minutes, and we'll go to Adam Holloway.
It's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. When 65% of the people in my constituency, Gravesham, voted in the 2015 referendum, they cast their votes in favour of leaving the EU, and they did so in the expectation that their views would be respected and in the hope that the government would have the guts to make a success of it. In these ambitions, my constituents have not been well served. Their clear instructions to us here in Parliament were not respected. For years, the government, with the collusion of the civil service, treated Brexit as a gigantic strategic mistake by the people of the United Kingdom, and they saw their role of one of damage limitation. But in 2019, the electorate had the chance to speak again, returning Boris Johnson with a huge majority, and he respected that mandate and was finally able to deliver Brexit. It's fatally depressing, really, to be here again, ostensibly debating whether or not the benefits of Brexit have been delivered and if there should be a public inquiry. But in fact, in reality, I think we're really arguing today about whether or not we should ever have voted to leave the EU or if we should rejoin. To me, the single most important benefit of Brexit has been realised, leaving aside some slightly unhappy compromises in the Windsor framework, because our sovereignty has been repatriated. Many Remainers seem to view our desire to govern ourselves as at best an outmoded and abstract concept, and at worst a front for baser impulses. Do you know, I came in here earlier, and I took one look at all these articulate advocates of remain or rejoin, and I thought that in the interest of my blood pressure, which I tested this morning, I'm not going to do it. No, I'm not going to. No, sorry. No, I'm sure you can address that in your speech. We've heard a lot from you on the subject already. But it's easy to undervalue sovereignty if in the areas in which it was surrendered to the EU don't actually impact your life. It's easy to disdain patriotism if you're economically and socially mobile and derive your self-worth from a well-paid job, or if your life is made easier by cheap labour as a result of free movement. But in my constituency, EU membership has brought with it social problems, pressures on housing, both in the social and private sectors, an enormous stress on public services, and a sense of disenfranchisement. My constituents aren't crazed nationalists, but are hard-working people who voted to take back control over the laws that directly affect their quality of life, and to have the right to vote out politicians who make laws that don't work for them. This power is important to them, and it's important to me that we deliver on that promise. In terms of the economic benefits of Brexit, we should have the courage of our convictions and stop being so cautious. It was encouraging to hear Jeremy Hunt unveil his post-Brexit reform of financial services, which aims to give us a regulatory framework that meets the needs of our financial services industry and which could respond effectively to emerging trends. With the freedom to diverge from EU law, we can now make substantial changes in many areas to things like the regulation of insurance firms. The risk margin, a capital buffer that insurance companies must hold, will be cut by 65% for life insurers and 30% for general insurers, and their eligibility of assets that life insurers can use to match their liabilities will therefore be broadened. This will free up capital for investment in the UK economy and improve the competitiveness of the important financial services industry, bringing benefits to consumers. But the government must stick to its promise to make substantial legislative progress in this area over the course of 2023. Reform of the financial services regulations is just one area where we now have the freedom to extricate ourselves from a regime that was not designed with our best interests in mind. But there are a host of opportunities we must now seize. We must make progress with the retained EU law bill, and we must take advantage of our freedom from EU control of state aid, and we must make sure our immigration system works for the people of this country. It's a difficult task to disentangle us from a heap of legislation we did not choose, but it's a vital job, and we should be bold and move quickly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call Vera Hobhouse.
I want to congratulate those who have made sure that this petition is come to this House and we are debating it today, and for the excellent opening speech. Chair, in my Bath constituency, 70% voted to remain, and we remain proudly pro-European. We are, in Bath, an open, welcoming and international city. We understand that in our modern, interconnected world, wishing we could just cut ourselves off and float into the Atlantic Ocean is entirely unrealistic and indeed undesirable. Most of my constituents feel a deep sense of loss at our exit from the European Union, and many in our community are now paying the price. Discussing Brexit has become, well, let's say, a bit of a political taboo. An inquiry into the impact would help us to face up to reality and give a true picture of the impact on people, business, and the whole of the economy. We need evidence, not government propaganda. There's now a large amount of data on the damage Brexit is inflicting on our economy. However, this needs to be put out into the open. This is why an inquiry into the impact of Brexit is so important. We are the only G7 nation with an economy smaller than it was before the pandemic. The OBR has said that leaving the EU will reduce the UK's long-term GDP by about 4%. The UBR assumes that UK imports and exports will both be 15% lower in the long run compared with remaining in the EU. It will leave a larger scar on our economy than the pandemic. Can I say that again? It will leave a larger scar on our economy than the pandemic. We should be making it easier for British small business to trade abroad, but instead they are now tangled in red tape. Supply chains are drying up as EU businesses are voting with their feet. Why bother with the UK when other businesses across the EU are happy to take over? Brexit was always going to restructure our economy. The blunt reality is that fine-tuning and tinkering on the edges of our trading relationship with Europe will not be enough. Without a relationship based on trust and respect, we cannot provide long-term stability for businesses or the economy. And this, I think, Mr. Chair, is at the heart of what we are debating today. Not only do we need to see an inquiry to put open the evidence of what Brexit meant, but also helping to restore our relationship with the European Union. Brexit has made this government hostile environment even more hostile. EU citizens who have built their lives here were made to feel unwelcome. It is no wonder that many of them have left. Among these were vital NHS workers, and the government face up to their role in forcing out the staff we so desperately need. I am a European migrant and became a British citizen in 2007. No government minister can reassure me that Brexit was not meant to make citizens who were born in the EU feel unwelcome. I do. It has and it does, and no amount of reassurance from the government will change this. Vital workers in vital professions are leaving. The Nuffield Trust has argued that EU-trained medics now face extra bureaucracy and higher costs. If pre-Brexit recruitment patterns had continued, the NHS would have 165 more psychiatrists, 288 more paediatricians, and 394 more anaesthetists. I'm happy to do.
Thank you very much. I thank the honourable member for giving me. She's making a very powerful case. Would she agree with me, however, that it's across the board in employment we are seeing that gap appearing because we've lost so many European members from our workforce? In my city of Edinburgh, before Brexit, 50% of the workforce in hospitality, a vital industry, came from other European countries. Week after week, those same employers now tell me they can't fill those jobs. Does she agree with me that we're suffering that cost?
Well, I'm happy to agree. I could fill hours and hours with making examples, but we only have a limited amount of time, and so I'm picking up the NHS. But yes, absolutely, this is the picture across the board. Each of these vacancies are hurting communities as patients from the NHS patients face painful delays and waiting lists. Only 1 in 3 adults in Bath have been able to secure an appointment with an NHS dentist. Yet the government refuses to recognise EU dentist qualifications. Brexit is also destroying our cultural links with the European Union, and I think that is one of the most painful things that I can talk about in a city like Bath, where hospitality, but also entertainment and culture is such a vital sector. The UK music industry is world-renowned, deservedly so. We should be proud of this and do everything possible to promote it. But this vibrant sector is hamstrung at every corner, with both EU and UK artists struggling to tour. Visa and work permit rules often vary between EU member states. Musicians are now forced to spend much of their time and money figuring out how to meet different standards of different EU countries. It is a devastating setback for artists who want to perform and not battle bureaucracy. Cabotage rules restrict UK hauliers over 3.5 tonnes from going to more than 3 different EU countries. The associations of British orchestras say these rules are increasing tour costs by up to £16,000 per day for orchestras using their own vehicles. This seriously restricts the viability of touring. Another consequence of Brexit for the music industry is more complicated customs rules. The ATA carnet required for moving unaccompanied instruments from the UK to the EU costs up to £310 plus VAT, plus a deposit of 30 to 40% of the value of its items. They are also time-consuming to prepare and cause customs delay and concert cancellations. These barriers are limiting our cultural reach and stunting our £5.8 billion music industry. An Encore musician survey shows that 76% of musicians agree that likely Brexit travel restrictions will stop them from performing in Europe. We must establish exactly what difficulties our art sector is facing. And there is no time, as I've already said, to point out to more industries and more difficulties for these industries. These are the realities that everybody in this country is now facing. An inquiry is not intended to go over old ground from the years of Brexit debate. It should focus on the here and now without prejudice. The government wants to ignore the many difficulties created by Brexit and concentrate on what it classes as our Brexit freedoms. Let's compare what was promised and what has not been delivered. Covering up problems will not make them disappear. We urgently need an inquiry to establish the truth about our exit from the EU. If we are going to solve the problems, we first have to acknowledge that they exist. Thank you.
Thank you. Call Flair Anderson.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the Honourable Member for Linlithgow and East Falkirk for sponsoring this hugely important debate, and to Peter Packham for calling for the petition and organising this across the country. Over 180,000 people, Chair, have signed this petition now, including 439 in my constituency, and the numbers are rising all the time. It's a clear indication that the public's patience with this government's botched Brexit deal has evaporated, and they want answers. An online poll of 1,340 voters by Omnisys last week showed that 59% thought that an inquiry should probably or definitely be launched, with just 25% against. And we know why. It's because the government are not giving answers to the questions. It shouldn't need to take an inquiry to get these answers. Week in and week out, Labour has been raising the issues about the impact of Brexit. And I understand the frustration of the public and why an inquiry is being called for. An inquiry would be hugely expensive and very delayed. It would take a long time, but people want these answers now so that we can mitigate against the damage being caused by Brexit. Or, as the Honourable Member pointed out, if it's so wonderful, if there's a Brexit dividend and we're seeing all the success, we would love to know what that is. So whatever you think about Brexit, whether you support it or not, whether you think it's been good for the country or not, whether there's been a Brexit dividend that maybe will come in time but just not yet, everyone should support an assessment of the outcome so far. It's been such a defining political moment of our time that we do need to know answers about what has been the result, and very importantly, to mitigate against any damage that is being caused. I actually called for a debate on this back in December 2021. I said, can we have a debate on the impact of Brexit and a region-by-region report? Now, the leader of the House, the then leader of the House, gave me this response. We can start prayers every morning with a celebration of Brexit. We should have the Brexit prayer and perhaps the Brexit song, because it's been a triumph for this nation and reassert its freedom. I'm not giving a very good interpretation of the then leader of the House's accent in saying this, but he said, I believe we have now happy fish, and that there's general celebrating and rejoicing across the country. This is the level of delusion, flippancy, not taking this issue seriously, that is very, very frustrating for people across this country, and why they have signed this petition in such large numbers. This cannot be the last word, just writing it off, just saying it's a success, without actually giving evidence for that. So we need to know the impact because of the enormous political cost of this debate to our country. because big promises were made to voters before the referendum. Are those promises being delivered? We need to disentangle the impact of Brexit and COVID and the energy crisis and the cost of living crisis and Ukraine, so that it cannot be just written off that any problems that we're facing as a country are because of Ukraine and the cost of living crisis and COVID, rather than finding out what is the impact of the cost of Brexit. And because we need to know who is being impacted, region, by age, by sector. There are so many different places within our country that are impacted. It's about environmental standards, food standards, financial services, school trips, agriculture, fishing, the construction industry, creative industries and musicians, about the impact on the workforce, especially the NHS and health services, about the impact on education, educational opportunities, on scientific research, on school trips. It's about security and the loss of businesses. All of these things are never being brought together by the government, so we cannot hear the cumulative impact on all these areas. Many different think tanks and researchers are giving us the costs of Brexit, but again, we're not hearing those definitive answers, although Labour are asking for them again and again. Bloomberg says it costs the UK economy $100 billion a year. The IMF forecast will be the only leading economy to shrink. The Office for Budget Responsibility conclude that Brexit will reduce long-run productivity by 4%. The Centre for European Reform said that by the end of last year, the economy was 5%, or £31 billion smaller than if we'd stayed in the EU. Surely, with these figures being quoted, we need to have a better, clearer, independent assessment of the facts. Red tape being faced by businesses is at a record high. Customs export declarations that businesses must fill in when moving goods from the UK more than tripled after the UK left the single market and the customs union, while import declarations have increased by 50% during this time. I've had several businesses in my constituency in Putney report exactly this, and we've lost 300 businesses in Putney, Roehampton and Southfields since 2021. I would like to know why this is and what part of this has been the impact of Brexit and what can be addressed, course-corrected right now to stop this damage. The music industry has been mentioned in this debate already. The failure to secure ease of access for touring bands across the EU is embarrassing and ludicrous, and surely this can be changed. And school trips from the European Union and to the European Union by schools have been reduced. The School Travel Forum reported a reduction from 13,000 overseas trips in 2019 to just 2,500 in the first 8 months of last year. Obviously, part of that is COVID, but a huge part of that is the change in passport requirements and increasing costs for parents to have a visa that's increased the administrative burden, having that impact on school trips. And that can also be changed right now. Then there's the impact on the workforce. Many EU citizens who've left were key workers, the backbone of our public services. All working people should and deserve to know the impact on our healthcare facilities. Every healthcare facility I visit tell me that there's a clear impact of Brexit on recruitment and the delivery of healthcare. Labour keeps asking, keeps exposing the impact on working people, and the government must answer these questions. So to conclude, when the Minister comes to respond, I hope that he shows more humility than the former Leader of the House, who I quoted at the beginning of my speech. The government cannot run from scrutiny on Brexit forever. The public deserve answers. They deserve honest reflection, hard facts and figures, and a plan for putting right some of the worst damage of Brexit. And I hope to hear that from the Minister later. Thank you.
Thank you. I call Amy Callaghan.
Thank you, Mr McCabe. It's a pleasure to see you and the Chair. In summary, the people of Eastern Bartonshire voted overwhelmingly to remain in the European Union, 71.4% to be precise, as did people right across Scotland. And this desire to remain, or now to rejoin the EU, has only risen in the years since Brexit, as each impact has cut deeper. A public inquiry into these impacts is not an unreasonable request. It's a request of support. And if the government truly believes in its Brexit benefits, then they should put it to the test with a public inquiry. all the impacts of Brexit, everything the people of Scotland have lost out on, has not been done in our name, nor apparently has it been done under the banner of Brexit, as this government have been taking great pleasure in denying much of which we are debating today having anything to do with Brexit. In their response to this petition, the government stated that leaving the EU was a democratic choice. Yes, the government exercised a referendum, putting the decision to the people, but leaving the EU was not the democratic will of the people of Scotland. And if the democratic will of the people is the government's trump card in this debate, then why do they continue to deny the people of Scotland the right to hold an independence referendum? This is not a British government we've voted for. And to be clear, the impact of this government policies, from Brexit right to austerity, are not representative of the progressive values of the majority of the people in Scotland. Let's think back to all we were promised if the UK left the European Union: increased trade with the whole world, saving £350 million a week to spend on public services, controlling our immigration, controlling our borders. In the years since Brexit, Britain has become far more insular. Trade is down across the board, and both of the government's plans to turn that around will have little impact even by their own assessment. This is all whilst trade has soared across Europe. England's public services are a mess and they're underfunded. A hostile environment to immigration has left us with significant skills gaps in certain sectors with large-scale recruitment issues, including, but not confined to, the culture sector, the hospitality sector and our public health services across the UK. Others have expanded on some of these issues. I'll focus on the NHS. Staff shortages in the NHS is one of the biggest issues we're facing at this moment, due to people from European countries being unable to live and work here with ease. Ending participation in Erasmus Plus when EU membership is not a barrier to this opportunity, and Scotland certainly hasn't seen any of this money that was going to be saved. This government will continue to deny most or all of what we're debating today, but the long and short of this is the cold, hard facts with an evidence base that can't and shouldn't be denied. Take the UK's economy as an example of this. The UK has the slowest growing economy in the G7. The former Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, Sir Howard Davies, stated that Brexit is one of the reasons we're at the bottom of the growth table of the major industrialised countries. It's on Brexit and it's on the Tories. The OBR Chair, Richard Hughes, has said the UK's economy is 4% smaller in GDP terms because of Brexit. The government deflect and try and blame our shrinking economy on the war in Ukraine, which is shameful. Blaming an illegal war in Ukraine instead of acknowledging it's a mess of their own making. Again, it's on Brexit and it's on the Tories. There is now unnecessary red tape when travelling to the EU. For those wanting to visit for 90 days or longer, Chair, it's necessary to apply for a full long-term immigration visa with associated costs and hassle. UK travellers have lost the automatic right to fast-track passport and customs queues in EU member states, and may be asked for proof of funds and a return ticket when entering an EU country. And to what benefit? Again, it's on Brexit and it's on the Tories. Chair, to bring my remarks to a close, leaving the European Union is not what Scotland wanted, and the impact of being dragged out shows exactly why. Life is hard enough, and leaving the EU has only made it harder. But life post-Brexit has only been made worse by a government denying what was promised to people across these four nations who voted to leave in good faith. A shrinking economy, understaffed public services, no freedom of movement. Stick that on the side of a bus. Where Westminster continues to fail us, the people of Scotland will look ahead to a bright future, one without this place, one without austerity and one without a Tory government we didn't vote for as an independent nation within the European Union. Thank you.
Stephen Farry.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mr McCabe. I want to make some very specific comments in relation to Northern Ireland shortly, but first I want to make some common points that apply UK-wide. And indeed, before getting to that, outside of the context of the Northern Ireland issue, which has obviously been very prominent over recent months and years, it is rare that more generally we have a debate in this place in relation to Brexit itself. Yet it has fundamentally changed so much in relation to the UK economy. our ability to influence transnational issues, such as how we deal with crime, how we deal with the environment, and of course it has diminished the UK's international standing. The UK is not as powerful a voice on the world stage that it was previously. The European Union served to amplify that voice. And in that regard, I think it's useful maybe just to drill down into this notion of sovereignty for a moment. Sovereignty for me is about the ability to do things rather than some abstract concept. But even if you go into the point around the abstract concept of sovereignty, the fact that the UK was able to enter the European Union and also to leave proves that the UK had sovereignty all along. But it was through pooling that sovereignty within the European Union that we were able to deliver collective outcomes for people right across Europe, but crucially for people within the UK. Happy to give way.
Some say, and I think the member for Gravesham mentioned, that the laws that were created weren't laws that we chose. But the fact is we had MEPs, we were on those commissions, and we were on those committees that decided them. And actually the British voice was a leading light in many of those changes that were enacted. So it's not true to say there were changes that need to be made, certainly in the processes, but we didn't not have a seat at that table.
Indeed, and I think, agreeing with what my honourable friend has said, we will soon discover that in many respects that the UK, by design, will have to be a rule taker, because it is fundamentally interesting to the UK economy to follow rules that are essentially set at a European level, but without having that important say that we had previously. Like my colleague and indeed many other people in this debate today, including the honourable member for Leeds Central, I sit on the Trade and Business Commission, and almost every week we are hearing evidence from a whole range of experts and other stakeholders that are setting out huge concerns in relation to the impact of Brexit on their very particular sectors. It's also accurate to say that the UK economy has seen seriously constrained growth as a consequence of Brexit. Of course, there are other issues, but by far that is the major standout factor that differentiates the UK from its other main competitor nations in terms of, in particular, the developed world. The trade deals that are happening around the world will never compensate for the increased trade barriers that we have erected with our closest and biggest external trading partner. It is one thing to say that the European Union perhaps is not growing at the same rate in terms of international trade, but having a trading partner that maybe represents 30 to 40% of the international market, compared to something that grows from 0.1 to 0.2%, which on the surface may be a very radical change in terms of the level of trade, but it doesn't amount to the same impact in terms of UK business. And also, we have discovered that freedom of movement, who knew, applies in two different directions. So what has happened in terms of constraining the ability of others to come here also applies for UK citizens whenever they're seeking to move overseas. I do want to focus a little bit in relation to the impact on Northern Ireland, and in some ways I sort of feel slightly humbled in this respect because we have had, at the very least, the benefit of the Windsor framework. I do wish to put on record again my appreciation for those who were involved in the reaching of that agreement, both on the UK side and the European Commission. But at best, the Windsor framework is a soft landing for Northern Ireland, but Northern Ireland will still suffer many of the same issues that the UK as a whole is facing from Brexit, but also some further very particular challenges that are unique to our own geographical situation on the island of Ireland. If we look at the issue, perhaps the most apparent consequence lies in terms of our governance. And I've no doubt my colleague, the honourable member for Strangford, will take a different view on this whenever he speaks shortly. But for me, our governance worked based upon sharing and interdependence. It relied upon the joint membership of the UK and Ireland within the Single Market and Customs Union. And that, in turn, allowed us to have those interlocking relationships, both within Northern Ireland, on the island of Ireland, and within the UK, and allowed a balance of different identities to be expressed without that much encumbrance. However, a Brexit, particularly a hard Brexit, will pose some threats to people's sense of identity and create some degree of economic friction. The Windsor Framework has gone a long way to mitigate some of that. However, it does only apply to goods. It doesn't apply to the other fundamental freedoms around services, capital and the freedom of movement. Yes?
Crazy.
A very powerful point about how important the Windsor Agreement is. Does he therefore not agree with me that one of the egregious things about Brexit is pushing things like the retained EU law bill, which in of itself fundamentally undermines the Windsor Agreement by removing all those very alignment of laws around goods and indeed services on which the Windsor Agreement is based? It just reflects how Brexit has blinded people to what is in the best interests of people, whether in Northern Ireland or the rest of the United Kingdom.
Yeah, I'm grateful to the honourable member for those comments, and I had hoped that wisdom would eventually prevail in relation to that legislation. It is something that I feel is fairly, not just pointless, but is needlessly self-destructive and will pose particular problems to Northern Ireland, given that we currently don't have a functioning assembly, and if the current sunset clause at the end of this year still applies, we don't actually have the space to actually put in place successor pieces of regulation to cover for all the gaps that may or may not emerge. And there is also a very particular challenge to the fundamental freedoms that are set out in the Good Friday Agreement and also transposed in terms of Article 2 of the protocol, which has now itself become the Windsor Framework. And I suppose it is important to recognise that we are making these comments in the context of the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, which happened earlier this month. And last week there was a major conference at Queen's University in Belfast, and we had the Prime Minister over there pledging his ongoing support to the agreement, praising all those who have got us to this particular point, without actually at the same time recognising that some of the policies that the government are pursuing in relation to Brexit, including retained EU law, are posing a major threat to people's rights in Northern Ireland. So beyond the issue around the movement of goods, there are issues in terms of access to labour and skills, which is particularly problematic in our economy. And like everywhere else in the UK, services are by far the largest aspect of our economy. The contrast on the end of Ireland is now becoming incredibly stark. Northern Ireland is going through major difficulties, not least due to our lack of functioning Assembly and Executive, but we are facing into a budget crisis. We have very sluggish economic indicators. By contrast, our friends on the other part of the island have actually are actually expecting a massive surplus, potentially as much as €20 billion over some of the next couple of financial years. They have much higher growth than Northern Ireland. Their productivity levels are much higher, and that is creating a major tension for an economy that does compete in that all-island context as well as a pan-UK context. Another point I just want to put on record, Chair, before I conclude, which is something I've no doubt other members will wish to pick up, is around the loss of European Union funding, which particularly was so crucial for some of the more marginalised parts of the UK, and I appreciate that's a particular factor in Wales, but also places like Merseyside, Cornwall, and simply what has replaced it through the Shared Prosperity Fund cannot compensate for what has been lost in that particular regard. And it is undoing, shall we say, what the government are notionally trying to do in terms of levelling up, because the money isn't simply there. The same thing applies in terms of research funding. One of the things the UK is internationally renowned for is the quality of our research and development, the quality of our universities and how we actually innovate. But again, through not actually being part of Horizon Europe, we are losing opportunities. And it's not simply a matter of the funding, important as funding is, it's the international collaboration, it's the networks. If you speak to any scientist, they will say all this has to happen at scale and you have to be part of those networks. And the UK is going through a process of needlessly marginalising itself. So I very much welcome this petition and would embrace an inquiry. It's only through properly discussing these issues and having an honest conversation that we can begin to undo the damage that has been done over the past few years. And I look forward to a mature reflection on what needs to happen to restore the UK's place in the world. Thank you very much.
Sarah Green.
Thank you, Mr. McCabe. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. For many of us, the impact of our exit from the European Union is clear, and painfully so. Business owners have struggled to navigate a new and confusing trade landscape. Holidaymakers have been met with queues at Dover, and shoppers have struggled to cobble together the produce to create a salad. Yet the government continues to deny that these issues have anything to do with their Brexit deal. The government's insistence on avoiding the obvious is deeply frustrating. No doubt it is this sense of frustration that has led so many people to demand the inquiry we're here to discuss today. I want to focus on areas where there can be little doubt that Brexit has had a negative impact on businesses, artists and musicians, and the care sector. Business owners are facing additional costs directly because of Brexit, and they've made their feelings on this clear to me. One expressed his frustration at the amount of time and money he now spends specifically on completing additional paperwork that didn't exist prior to our exit from the European Union. He wasn't the only one to describe the heavy bureaucratic load imposed on them by Brexit. The quarterly Buckinghamshire Business Barometer shows that a significant number of businesses in my area are facing these increased costs. One of their reports states that 42% of businesses in Bucks are facing higher costs as a result of increased red tape. Nearly a third are paying extra tariffs or taxes, and a quarter are paying the price for changes to their supply chain. For small businesses who cannot afford to outsource or employ someone to deal with the additional red tape, the strain can be immense. More than one small business owner locally told me that they were on the brink. Chesham and Amersham is also home to a significant number of artists and musicians who previously drew a chunk of their income from touring in Europe. As other members have alluded to, in sharp contrast to the freedom these artists previously had to tour, they have to apply for visas and work permits, and the instruments and equipment they need also often require additional paperwork and permissions. One constituent who works for a prominent opera company told me that the extra burden they now face makes it much, much harder to put on a show, potentially prohibitively so. I want to finish by sharing the experience of a care company that serves my constituents. Its owner recently told me, in very emotional terms, how most days he has to tell someone he cannot provide the care they are seeking for a loved one because he just can't find the staff. The loss of skilled workers from the EU is having a direct impact on our ability to care for the sick, elderly and vulnerable. Our health and social care sector needs more staff, and while we should certainly invest in training more here in the UK, this will not address the immediate shortages we're facing today. The impact of our exit from the European Union has been wide-ranging. The many members of the public it has affected, both personally and financially, deserve honesty and accountability from this government. We cannot begin to fix things until we have an honest appraisal of Brexit's impact, and it's why we need an independent inquiry. Thank you.
Jim Shannon.
I'm not sure if I've been decided about cheering as much when we're finished, but that's by the way. Look, the thing is, we hope to have an engaging debate, conversation, and we'll hopefully we can agree to disagree on some of the things. The honourable gentleman's away, by the way. I have probably some things to say and some outstanding things still to find. But can I thank the honourable member for Lithnagow and East Falkirk for introducing the debate for the petition, and he did that very, very balanced, and I thank him for that. I probably think that's maybe as far as we can go on that one. We'll have some differences of opinion in relation to where we are, but I'm a stark believer in democracy and the democratic process. Whatever that process will be and whatever the outcome of that is, I believe in democracy. It's a foundation which my party, the DUP, was built on. So I wholeheartedly believe in the results of the Brexit vote. I voted for Brexit. My constituency of Strangford, just for the record, voted 56% to leave, 44% to stay. Every person, certainly not every person, most of the people in Portavogie in my constituency, the fishing village, they endorsed Brexit by over 90% of those who cast their votes. So there is a wish to see Brexit delivered for my constituency of Strangford. I'm also, however, the first to say that my full support lay with exiting the EU. And the repercussions that have come from it. Unfortunately, we are 7 years on from the referendum, and yet there is still outstanding work to be done on how truly to reflect on how we can make the best out of the cards that we've been dealt. Why did Portavogie in my constituency vote so wholeheartedly, as I did and many others did, for Brexit? Because they saw opportunities for the fishing sector, not restricted by Brussels, not restricted when it came to the fishing issues, and for job opportunities, for potential to invest, for growth, and for the total allowable catch to then be in the hands of Westminster, not to be in the hands of Brussels. All those red tape things over the years were issues that we felt particularly strong about. So for that reason, Portavogie and my constituency also felt it was important to move forward. The agri-sector, and I make this point as well, I'm very conscious of time, Mr. Chairman, and I'll probably have to curtail some of my speech because of the time issues. The agriculture sector that is so important to my constituency of Strangford, that in itself, but not just the factories that we have, but also the farmers who sell their dairy products into Lakeland dairies, for an example, and then the market. We have some, I think, between 5,000 and 6,000 workers in the factories and also from the farms. But what Brexit did give the opportunity to Lakeland dairies to gain other markets across the world, and they have advanced that with some zest, enthusiasm and energy, and I'm very supportive of them, as indeed I know others are as well. So the opportunity to sell their products in the Far East, in South Africa, in South America, and indeed across, and the markets are still retained for Europe as well. So, Mr. Chairman, I don't think it's possible to have a conversation about the UK's exit from the EU and not dismiss or not discuss Northern Ireland. Rightfully so, we all have different opinions, and today we'll have to agree to different many things. But what is best for the UK, but more importantly, what is best for our constituents? So I'm no stranger to saying how wonderful my Strangford constituency is. I think it's the most beautiful constituency in the world, and that's just the way I feel. And I will maintain that as long as I can. So important to me, and I will always work to ensure the best for them, the best for the single-parent family, the best for the local dairy farmer, the best for the working class family of four, and the local business owner, and many, many more. It became blatantly clear to me, to many of my constituents, that the many plans and policies that the UK government had set out for Northern Ireland was simply not going to work. Whether this was through Theresa May's Chequers Plan, the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, and indeed the Windsor Framework, which my honourable friend and colleague from North Down referred to. We have a difference of opinion. We're still friends, by the way, but we have a difference of opinion, and there's no harm in having a difference of opinion. Northern Ireland is still not where it needs to be, and for me and my constituency, it's simply not good enough. There is still work to deliver. When the protocol was introduced in 2021, this meant a significant change in the constitutional status of Northern Ireland, which suspended the Article 6 of the Act of the Union. For me and for my constituency, the constitutional position is really, really important. We may have a difference of opinion and at least in that, but for my constituency that I want to represent in this House today in Westminster Hall, indeed in the Chamber when the opportunity arises, it's really important. It was supposed to protect the integrity of a new regime in Northern Ireland. The burden that was and is still on local businesses in my constituency has proven as instrumentally damaging to them, and still it often feels as if we are no further forward. On paper, the Windsor Framework did sort out some of the Green Lane issues, but it hasn't sorted out all of the outstanding issues which we really need to have. And that, for example, I make the point about agriculture, about the sector, about the cattle sales of my constituency of Strangford in the Mid-Down and North Down and South Down as well, where our sales for cattle and sterling across the water and also in northwest England are so important. Yet no, we're still subject to some of those rules under the Windsor Framework. And indeed, if they don't sell their products or their cattle, then they have to put them under quarantine for 3 months. Just one example. The other issues that are outstanding, which again is not a Brexit issue, but it's certainly a framework issue, and that's the legal opinion of the storm and break. All the legal opinion that we've got back tells us that the storm and break is not binding. The legal opinion that others have got back, be it the Orange Order individually, where it be the LCC across the water, or even the ERG here and others, the legal opinion is not binding. But one classic example, and I'll give this example, and I'm very conscious of time. Still not good enough. Was released in the newsletter paper just last weekend. A haulier from Randallstown has spoken to the newsletter on the impacts of the so-called green and red lanes we're having in Northern Ireland trade. He stated, and I quote, "The notion of a red and green lane is very binary. As far as haulage is concerned, there is no green lane between GB and Northern Ireland, none whatsoever. The only green lane is between the EU and Northern Ireland, via the Republic. This is a reality for Northern Ireland and must be recognised by the Secretary of State and the Prime Minister." And he also added, in many cases, it could mean the business asking, can I actually do this work? And that it could ultimately come to, can I actually survive? So that's a question on the lips of Northern Ireland hauliers. They don't see the benefits of this yet. We've witnessed other impacts, such as the impact for visa holders and the impact on young people, specifically regarding the UK participation in the Erasmus programme. There are no doubt constituents from across the entirety of the United Kingdom who have felt some impact from Brexit, but as a Strangford MP, I stand here in defence of my local business owners and constituencies, simply say it is not good enough. Whilst the decision of any vote must be respected, despite the outcome, we must not allow the people who vote to get us here in the first place to be under any kind of pressure. Hence my frustration at this process. I conclude with this, Mr. Chairman. I hope that these conversations don't end, and that the reassurance can be provided for our electorate that no matter what the outcome of the vote is, we can always do right. And at the moment, Northern Ireland has not had the Brexit that they voted for, and I believe that has to be addressed. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed. McCabe, the question in this debate is a very simple one. What has been the impact of leaving the European Union? And I was much struck reading the government's response to this petition, which I thought was really quite dismissive and defensive. In essence, it said it was a democratic decision, so there's nothing to look into here. Nothing's happening. Now, of course, it was a democratic decision. It has been made, and we remain, as with one exception, two exceptions, we lost. And the point that was made by the Honourable Member for Gravesham about sovereignty, I met many people during the campaign who made that argument. Indeed, they said, I don't care about the economic impact, my sovereignty is more important. And I respect people's right to hold that view. I fundamentally disagree with it. But what I think was unforgivable was to claim that we could have all our sovereignty, keep all the benefits of being members of the European Union, and get further benefits on top of that. It simply wasn't true. And we now know that it wasn't true. And therefore, those who argued for us to leave the European Union are now in a state of confusion and denial. That is what is going on, particularly about the economic consequences. And if we don't understand what they are, how on earth are we going to build a new, but different relationship with our European colleagues over the months and the years ahead? And it is interesting that there's a number of members here today with whom I had the pleasure of serving on the UK Trade and Business Commission, reference to which has already been made, because we felt it was important to ask that question. And then you let the evidence speak for itself. And if people want to come to before the Commission, say it's wonderful, look at these opportunities, I'd love to hear them. There haven't been that many who have, in fact, done that. And the truth is, it's had a bad impact on the economy. I was really struck by that statistic, which showed that the number of small businesses actually trading goods with the European Union declined by 1/3 between 2020 and 2021. Now, not entirely surprising, because it's small businesses that most find it difficult to cope with the burden, cost, bureaucracy and red tape. Brexit was never sold as, it was sold as getting rid of cost, bureaucracy and red tape. It's dumped the biggest load of those three things on British businesses we've seen in our lifetime. We're going to be the worst performing large economy in the world this year. Business investment as a percentage of GDP has stalled since the referendum in the UK. And it is worth just reminding ourselves what the Office for Budget Responsibility said. And I quote, "It will result in the UK's trade intensity being 15% lower in the long run than if the UK had remained in the EU, and the latest evidence suggests that Brexit has had a significant adverse impact on UK trade via reducing both overall trade volumes and the number of trading relationships between UK and EU firms." And ironically, while all of these costs have been imposed on British companies exporting, the government hasn't yet introduced full checks on goods coming into the United Kingdom from the European Union. Why hasn't it done that? Because it's afraid about shortages and delays. So the sovereignty that has been gained is not being used to apply the same checks going one way as we are facing going the other way. The trade deals have been referred to. I was very struck when the former Environment Secretary, the member for Camborne and Redruth, described the Australia Agreement as being actually not a very good deal because we've given far too much away. We all know that that's the case. And the promised trade deal with the United States of America, the biggest argument we heard, absolutely nowhere to be seen. It's not happening. It's not coming. And the fundamental truth is, if you make trade with your biggest trading partner more difficult, which is what we've done, then don't be surprised if it has an adverse effect on the British economy at a time when we need all the growth we can get to help our constituents. And we've heard about employers finding it hard to get workers. I was very struck when we visited, as the Commission, the fruit farm in Kent. And the owner of that said, last year I couldn't pick 8% of my crop because I couldn't find enough workers. And do you know what I'm doing this year? I'm planting less crop and I'm going to import more fruit from the rest of the world. What a wonderful advert for the growth of the British economy, that is the conclusion that farmer was for. I will give way, yes.
Looking at these issues as a member of the Shadow DEFRA team, it's really ironic that what we're finding is that we're having less UK production and more import directly from the EU, which actually is a negative impact of Brexit rather than a positive impact of us being able to trade out. So it's exactly the opposite of the claims and exactly why we need to have something like this.
Well, indeed, that is the case. If you make it more difficult for your businesses, and we want as much export opportunity as possible, don't be surprised if it damages people. And the other irony about sovereignty is the government said we're going to use our sovereignty to introduce a British version of the REACH chemicals regulation. Now, they've just postponed it for the second time, not least because the British chemical industry has said, you know, it's going to cost us about £2 billion for absolutely no purpose whatsoever to get back to where we were when we originally got our chemicals assessed under REACH. The UK CA mark, which is meant to replace the CE mark you find on the bottom of lots of goods that are made, the government's postponed that again because a lot of British businesses say, what is the point of doing this? What is the point? And on the retained law bill, which is an artificial mechanism to try and force through changes to retained EU law, I remain of the view, despite the concerns that have been expressed, that by the end of the year, we will still be in alignment with a lot of EU law, partly because we argued for a lot of it in the first place. You know, it wasn't imposed upon us. We were part of the decision-making process, and because a cost comes to the economy from diverging from the rules that are applied by our biggest trading partners. And the fact is, every company that is exporting to Europe, well, they're going to make their goods to the standards set by Europe, whatever the British government thinks, because that's what you do if you want to continue to trade. And it is really striking that those who argued so strongly for these benefits, no upsides, no downsides, only upsides, all of those quotes that come back, I think, now to haunt those who made them, they find it very difficult to know what to say, so they try and blame Remainers. It's like all revolutionaries, if I may use the analogy. When the revolution doesn't quite work out, they say, but comrade, it was not applied with sufficient vigour and purity. An argument that some members in the chamber may be more familiar with than others. And The truth is that, and this is the hard part of this debate, is we cannot simply reverse what has happened. It is very striking that when I look at not the governing party, but the major other parties represented in the House, with the exception of the SNP, who want another referendum for another purpose, none of those parties are saying we should have a referendum after the next election to see whether the British people want to change their minds. Because you can't reverse it just like that. And we know that. I looked at the words. The Green Party say, rejoin as soon as the political situation is favourable and the right terms are available. I think that's an interesting observation. The Lib Dems, as I understand their current position, rejoin the single market once the ties of trust and friendship are renewed. And the truth is we're going to have to build a new but a different relationship with the European Union. It's going to take time. Who knows what it will look like? Who knows what this country will look like in 10 or 20 or 30 years? But in order to do that, we have to be honest about the effect that this change has had on our country and our economy. And that is why this question needs to be asked.
Thank you, Chair. And it's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Member who chaired the Brexit Select Committee so effectively when I was a member. As we have heard, nearly 178,000 people have signed the petition, and I'd like to thank each and every one of them, and also my honourable friend from the SNP for securing the debate. Now, it would appear that the UK government does not believe that this is an appropriate subject for debate. People watching at home will have realised, of course, that we are now in the second chamber holding the debates, not in the main chamber, and we're not holding it in government time either, for that matter. And they don't seem to believe that Brexit is a subject for a public inquiry. Now, I appreciate that many government supporters will want to leave the division of the Brexit years behind. Brexit is done and dusted, they say. Let's put the tensions of the past few years behind us and get on with reaping the benefits of Brexit. Now, I opposed Brexit, as did my right honourable and honourable friend, as did my party, as did my constituents, though I concede not everyone in Wales. We did lose by a short head. But now, a recent poll by Focal Data shows that the number of people regretting their decision to leave outnumber remaining Brexit supporters in every constituency in Wales. Every constituency in Wales is now of that opinion, apparently. But as to Brexit's benefits, well, I would dearly love to see some benefits from Brexit. Brexit's benefits would suit the people of Wales fine, just fine. But as yet, those benefits of Brexit are singularly elusive. The government face at least two ways on this. They say, well, Brexit is an event which is over and done with, so setting us upon the sunlit uplands, let's get on with it. Or they say it is an ongoing process, and at some undefined points in the future, those benefits will appear. Well, I think they can't have it both ways. They can't have a process and they can't have an event. It's one or the other, and quite obviously, Brexit is a process which at the very best is bogged down and not delivering, or at worst is a process which will deliver nothing but further chaos, further decline and further poverty. With trust in the government at such a low, the Conservatives and their friends continue peddling the Petitions myth that the UK's economic malaise is the result of the war in the Ukraine or the aftershocks of the pandemic, etc. The facts of international comparisons on inflation, on growth and a host of other measures actually are against them. As we heard from the member for Gravesend now, inexplicably absent from his seat, finance is being favoured ahead of other sectors. Finance is being favoured certainly ahead of manufacturing. A practical example, the decline of the Welsh steel industry is being accelerated by a trade policy that deliberately strains supply chains. Now, at the other end of the scale, in my own constituency, the Menai mussel industry, which was thriving and thriving on the basis of exports mainly to Belgium, I should say. That Menai mussel industry has seen its business model wrecked by post-Brexit rules and has more or less disappeared in the short term at least. Welsh businesses are struggling to cope with mountains of Brexit red tape just to trade with our nearest neighbours. And many have, well, simply given up. One example which will interest the House is that of St Nurseries in my constituency, which I referred to in the Chamber last week. Now, St Nurseries exports live plants to Ireland. In my constituency, and my right honourable friend's constituency, in the uplands, you can actually see Ireland. It's just over there. You can see the lovely green hills of Wicklow, and that's where the plants go. However, Neil, who runs St Nurseries, has found that the only practical way of exporting his plants is not directly to Ireland, which is just over there, but rather through England, through Belgium, through France, down to Normandy or Brittany, and then over the long sea crossing to Ireland. I raised this with the Secretary of State for Trade and Industry and Trade last week. And her response eventually was that he could always use the green lanes. Now, either she doesn't understand that the green lanes only go to Northern Ireland, or perhaps she doesn't understand the difference between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, or possibly she had no answer and in desperation was reaching for the first thing that came to mind, that is green lanes, but completely useless for my friend at St Nurseries. That is just one small practical example of small businesses struggling with the effects of Brexit. Now, a first step towards understanding the Brexit debacle and what needs to be done would be an independent public inquiry into the Brexit campaigns themselves, I think. What was said, what was promised, what was delivered, what will never be delivered, who has benefited and who has lost out. Not least, as was referred to earlier on, in Wales, not least losing out on the EU funding, not least in the sector that's very close to my heart, the university sector, the problems that we have seen only this weekend around Horizon and rejoining Horizon, where the government apparently is demanding a rebase for the 2 years that we weren't able to join Horizon. Why weren't we able to join Horizon? Well, I'll allow you all to guess, but apparently we need a rebase for those 2 years where we weren't members of Horizon. When we have some answers to these questions, that's only then can we reckon up. If this government and their campaigning friends are so confident of the propriety, wisdom and value of Brexit as they seem to be, then they have nothing to fear. Thank you.
Hear, hear.
Colin Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr Dowd. It's a pleasure to serve with you in the chair, and I want to give my congratulations to Peter Packham for starting this petition and to the Honourable Member for Linlithgow and East Falkirk for introducing it with such customary eloquence. My Brighton Pavilion constituency has the second highest number of signatories to this petition, with 655 of my constituents signing it. And I know very well that many, many more than that support it. So I'm very pleased to be able to represent them here today. And one of that number, in an email about today's debate, wrote, and I quote, "I firmly believe that the public were misled systematically by campaigners for Brexit before the referendum. Although it's unlikely that the decision will be reversed, I believe that the record should show the truth, not a fantasy." Well, that short, simple message encapsulates some of the very many important reasons why I think we do need an inquiry and why I back the call made in the petition. And I do believe that if a sufficient number of people over time choose it, there is a way back into the European Union. That is the virtue and beauty of democracy. Now, the referendum campaign and the subsequent narrative about Brexit have been a litany of misinformation and disinformation. The infamous words on the side of the bus are just the tip of the iceberg, but let's start there. Whether that was the £350 million a week has been diverted from the EU towards the NHS. Well, as we've heard already several times this afternoon, the simple answer is no. The NHS budget in England alone has risen by more than 350 million a week since 2016, but that money has come from taxes, from borrowing, from squeezing other departments. It most certainly has not come from savings arising from Brexit, for the simple reason that those savings didn't materialise because the overall economic impact has been so severe. If the public hoped for a transformative sum for the NHS post-Brexit, they most certainly have not received it. Turning to the economy, during the Chancellor's recent autumn statement, he spoke for almost an hour without once acknowledging the economic catastrophe of Brexit. No reference to the OBR's warning that it will slash productivity by 4%, lead to a 15% drop in trade intensity, an 11% drop in investment, that it will increase food prices, deliver lower wages, workforce shortages, and the highest inflation in the G7. Now, I too am a member of the UK Trade and Business Commission, expertly chaired by the Right Honourable Member for Leeds Central. And since July 2021, we have been taking evidence about the impacts of Brexit. And as the Honourable Member has pointed out, we have not heard of these positive impacts that were claimed for it. To the contrary, what we've heard time and again is all of the evidence of the pain for small business in particular, and in particular why Brexit is seen as the primary reason we're the only G7 country still not reaching post-pandemic levels of growth. Yet whilst the government continues to keep its head firmly in the sand, denying anything other than positive outcomes, it cannot begin to adapt and resolve some of the many problems we're hearing are caused by Brexit. Misleading the public includes by wishful thinking. And who can forget those endless conjurings of sunlit uplands, ignoring reality, only telling half the story, cherry-picking and frankly plain lying. It all happened during the Brexit campaign, and it's happened since. Independent scrutiny and inquiry would help to set the record straight. Now, the leader of the Leave campaign's vilification of free movement, I think, was one of the most pernicious examples of that disinformation. They willfully perpetuated a hostile narrative about immigration, deliberately conflating asylum seekers, economic migrants and refugees, whipping up hatred and racism in the process. This was disinformation at its most destructive, and no wonder they're now so afraid of a light being shone on those impacts. And that brings me to the issue of democracy, because in the wake of the referendum, I set up an initiative called Dear Leavers. And we went around the country visiting those places that had registered some of the highest Leave votes and listened to people who voted Leave. And the overwhelming message was that people voted for Brexit because they felt powerless. They felt unheard by a political establishment that had not listened for decades. And frankly, the tragedy is that the political establishment is still not listening and people still feel powerless. Democracy, scrutiny, accountability, responsiveness have all been victims of Brexit. Evidence and experts were derided, Parliament was illegally prorogued, international law has been trashed. From unsettled constitutional questions to opposition to a ratification referendum, from the impact on the incredibly precious Good Friday Agreement to the dangerous retained EU law bill. Opposing a public inquiry into these matters, frankly, only adds insult to injury. Now, returning to my constituents' view that the Brexit decision will probably not be reversed, I have to say that it is with great sadness that I see that the Labour leadership has capitulated to the tyranny where even to talk about rejoining is somehow judged to be anti-democratic. I want to talk about it. The Green Party wants to talk about it. I think the public deserves that we should talk about it. If rejoining the EU is the right thing for our economy, for our environment, for workers' rights, for young people, for our public services, for trade and for more, then we should take that step when the time and the conditions are right. And we should be preparing for that possibility, taking step-by-step approach such as negotiating membership now of the Customs Union, full engagement with Horizon, regular adjustments to the Trade and Cooperation Agreement to ensure our interests are best supported, a general approach of maintaining alignment with EU regulations, so that means the back of that deeply dangerous retained EU law bill, the ongoing rebuilding of diplomacy, and I hope the ongoing rebuilding of our reputation as a trustworthy partner, which has frankly been trashed. But I want to talk about the status quo in this country too, because the Leave vote was a howl of rage about legitimate concerns which have still not been addressed. The social contract remains broken, the power game remains rigged. We didn't leave the EU because of anything that happened in Brussels or Strasbourg. We left primarily because what had happened in England. Because outside of the capital, every single region of England voted to leave the EU. And it's meant as no respect to Wales, primarily, which voted by a majority of only about 80,000 to leave. It's no disrespect to Wales to say it was an English vote that drove Brexit.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. It is significant that the highest vote in favour of leaving the European Union was recorded in Blaenau Gwent. Blaenau Gwent is also the constituency which received the highest level of European funding, but it is also the poorest constituency in Wales, and that reinforces the point that she was making. It was a howl of rage against poverty, against marginalisation, and all the rest of it.
I agree with him very much, and I believe one of the reasons that in England there was such a howl of rage was that because, while devolution has given powers to Scotland and Wales, not enough, but some powers, at the same time there are no political institutions that represent England, nothing to give political expression to our complex, rich reality, nothing to bring power to the regions of England. No wonder people voted to take back control, but they want control from Westminster, so they have the right to be able to make decisions about their own lives here. And so rethinking of our constitutional settlement more fundamentally, I think, is also key to mending some of the divisions in the UK. Brexit was the result of a divided UK, and it threatens to divide us still further unless we build a democratic consensus about changing that together for good.
Hear, hear.
Very good. Stella Creasy.
I didn't get my minute. Thank you, Mr Dowd. It's a pleasure to have you join us for this afternoon. I'm sorry that the member for Gravesham is no longer in his place, because in his contribution he embodied the challenge that we face in this debate. Indeed, it might be argued that he reflected Oscar Wilde's very famous statement that patriotism is the virtue of the vicious in the argument that he made. Let us, in his absence, correct the record in what he talked about insurance and explain that as an example of why we need better information in this debate. Because he said that somehow leaving the European Union would mean that we could deal with the level of risk that insurance companies have to account for. Well, actually, the European Commission is already reforming those rules and looking at those rules as well. So we could have done that work with them. And as ever, with this idea that the benefits of Brexit do appear, the benefit he talked about in terms of the matching adjustment is something that others in the financial sector have raised caution about. Whilst it may benefit the shareholders of insurance companies and lead to higher fees, those policyholders and pensioners whose policies are dependent on insurance policies may well face higher charges. That in itself embodies the difficulties we face in this debate, the reality, the messy reality of what Brexit is doing. But, Mr Dowd, I have no desire to rerun 2016 when the damage in 2023 is so apparent. And when the member from Gravesham talks about parliamentary sovereignty and mentions the retained EU law bill, the member for Leeds, please, I absolutely agree with him about the reality of what will happen to the laws. But I'll be damned if I'll take lectures about who is more patriotic, who is better at standing up for parliamentary sovereignty than those of us who are fighting a piece of legislation that will lead to 5,000 areas of law being transferred not back to this Parliament to make decisions on, but to the executive and to behind closed doors in number 10. The truth is, we know what damage Brexit is doing to our country. We've been seeing it for years now. Members already have talked about many of the impacts of the shortages of people working in our hospitality industry, health and social care, the blunt economic damage, the thousands of small businesses in constituencies across this country who've just given up trading. Because one of the truisms here is you can fight many battles in life, but you can't really fight geography. And not being able to trade as easily with 500 million consumers on our doorstep does make a difference. Those supply chains that have been severed by leaving the European Union, the wealth of paperwork that so many now face, the impact it has had on the cost of living. And that's a second truth in this debate. See, the public know when they're being gaslighted. They can see that all these other countries might have experienced the impact of Vladimir Putin, but they're not facing the same challenges that we are. The higher costs for food, because oddly enough, there are longer queues at the border to get things over here, for the production lines that the member from Wales so articulated so well. They can see that their kids are sitting in coaches for hours on end at the border, and they know that that isn't going to stop any time soon. The LSE has estimated that leaving the European Union added £210 to household food bills, costing the UK consumers a total of £5.8 billion. So we can't be a world-beating international leader if we're only doing it in our own backyard. And we can't do trade deals that aren't competitive when we are a smaller nation, not part of a bigger conglomerate negotiating with others. That's why the Americans are not going to put us first in the queue. And every single industry, whether it's in insurance or manufacturing, is facing a choice between following UK regulations or European regulations if it wants to be able to trade with that bigger market. The damage is clear. People can see the disruption. They can see the disruption in Northern Ireland. That's why I'm not surprised that fewer than 1 in 10 of the British public claim they could actually see a personal benefit to Brexit. And then actually when you ask them, well, what is that benefit? Only a third of them thought they could actually name something. And it's the same for the nationalists. We know this is not going well. And we know we can't see how it gets any better. We also know that time is of the essence, that the damage that is being done grows every day. The jobs that were here are going overseas. The businesses are relocating, retraining people in Belgium, in Germany, in France, so that they can continue trading. Why then am I frankly ambivalent about this petition and the idea of a public inquiry? Well, firstly, because there's no actual formal mechanism for following up on an inquiry, and we've seen the track record of this government when it comes to public inquiries, and actually listening and learning is not great. As of last November, there are 14 open statutory public inquiries covering everything from COVID and Grenfell to the Edinburgh tram system. The inquiry into undercover policing has gone on for 8 years, cost £60 million, and we still have no idea when it will make its recommendations. And for me, politics has always been about priorities. I cannot ask my community that is struggling with the cost of living, that has been fuelled by Brexit, that can see those opportunities slipping out of their hands, to wait any longer to see those benefits of Brexit. I am a patriot. I love my country, and that is why I will fight for its future and for those jobs and for those industries. And that means being ruthless about what we spend our time and effort on now. Absolutely holding this government to account for its failure to recognise that Brexit cannot work. It's just a series of problems that you have to sort. And the sooner you sort them, the sooner we might stand a chance of offering our kids a future. How do we do that? We've got to work out how we get direct access to that single market. We've got to work out how we deal with the paperwork, whether it is part of the Pan-European Mediterranean Convention or a bespoke customs union. We've got to get on and start talking to the Europeans about it rather than questioning whether they are friends or foe. We've got to get on with getting that visa system sorted out, not just so that the creative industry and the touring industry doesn't fall apart, but also so that our healthcare sector doesn't fall apart, so our hospitality sector doesn't fall apart, so that all those young people who work for businesses who are being told, look, do you have a European Parliament? If you don't, forget about it. We'll go to somebody else in the business. Don't lose those opportunities. The importance of the freedom to work to our economy. Brexit will already reduce long-run productivity by 4%, according to the OBR. The truth is, this country was struggling before Brexit happened. But Brexit is like going on holiday, setting fire to your hotel room because you've turned up on the first day and realised that there isn't a pool in the complex. It is making things fundamentally worse. And the honest truth, for those of us who care about the truth, who care about this country, is that we should not let this government get away with spending hours talking about whether the last 7 years have been any good. We've got to be focused on what can happen in the next 7 years. And I will hold every government to account for what they are doing to sort out that access to those jobs, to that trade, to help those small businesses, looking at the pile of paperwork and thinking, I just can't cope with it anymore, because it is too important not to. So we can have a public inquiry, we can go down that alley, but frankly, I would much rather go down the alley of solving the problems that Brexit has created, because the people in this country, those of us who are real patriots, need and deserve nothing less.
Thank you. Leila Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Dowd. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I, for one, am so grateful for this opportunity to debate this issue and for the petition for giving us the time. Because this government may not be interested in the damage that they're causing to so many, but clearly the public is, including, unsurprisingly, Oxford, West and Abingdon. When we were top 10, I have to say it did not necessarily come as a great surprise. And I can fully understand why. Because however way you cut it, this government's botched deal with Europe has been an unmitigated disaster for this country. It has made the cost of living worse for every household in Britain. It's the reason why we are in the relegation zone for global growth in league tables for developed economies, behind Russia, and has made all of us poorer. And we see it in our supermarket shelves, which at points were empty. The Prime Minister, when I asked him about this, blamed the weather and the war, but he couldn't answer why they haven't had the same problems in the European Union, and there's an obvious answer for that. The fishermen and the farmers who are tangled in red tape, they used to just have to complete one step in order to export their produce to the EU, and now some face 21 stages. We see it in the NHS and social care. There's fewer doctors, nurses, care workers, dentists. In Oxfordshire, 10% of our workforce came from the European Union. Countless of them have left, and that is repeated across the country. But above all, it's the small businesses, and I'm also a member of the UK Trade and Business Commission, a poor member, I should say. I don't go as often as I'd like. But every time that I have gone and I read the reports, it's small businesses that are really hit the most. And it's obvious to see why. The British Chamber of Commerce membership survey showed that more than half of respondents were facing difficulties in adapting to the new rules because they are complex, they're changing, and they just don't have the resource to do it. But the impact, and as important as the economy is, and it's desperately important now, aren't just economic. It's also stopped collaboration. And because that's what the European Union was always about. It was about pooling our resources, collaborating with others, sharing ideas, and nowhere, and I say this as a former science teacher, was that more important than in science. Because what has happened, and it was never just about the money, what it's done is it's stopped that crucial collaboration with European partners. For example, to do the research to beat cancer. Because the government didn't seek associate membership of the Horizon scheme at the point of the deal. And it's also students who are missing out in that formative exchange year, with the government's bargain basement replacement being underfunded by well over £20 million compared to the final year that we were in Erasmus. And to the punters who are looking forward to watching German punk band Trigger Cut, I can only apologise, because that band was turned away at Calais thanks to the government's red tape and not having the right paperwork. And yet this government's fingers are in their ears. Despite all the extraordinary damage, this issue has become the elephant in the room of British politics. They just don't want to talk about it, and that's why this public inquiry is so important. Because if we're going to move on, and no one here is trying to prosecute the arguments of the past, we are where we are, regrettably, but we are where we are. If we don't cool-headedly look at what's happened, then how on earth are we going to repair it? But rather than try and repair it, this government seems intent on making it worse. We thought that the Windsor framework actually was a moment of pragmatism from a government that, until that point, had chosen to use Brexit as a stick to revive their dwindling poll ratings, trying to sow division when actually they should be looking for pragmatic solutions. And it gave me some hope that we were moving on and the government was going to lead from the front. Well, that seems to not have happened. Because since then, the road to Horizon Europe is now open and the ministers are stalling. And I sincerely hope the minister does address that point. Why is our government stalling when there is no reason at all why we can't rejoin Horizon Europe? Time is of the essence. I've spoken to researchers who are looking at where we are now and making decisions about the next academic year. It's happening now, and we need answers immediately. And then there's the retained EU law bill, which is frankly a monstrous piece of legislation, one that doesn't threaten the comprehensive trashing of standards in the country on everything from sewage to workers' rights, but one that's also trashing our reputation on the world stage. I was heartened when the government delayed the bill in the Lords, but it's now reportedly back on the agenda, and I give them notice that the Liberal Democrat peers stand ready and willing to do undo as much of the damage that it's going to cause as possible. But the point is, why are we still in damage mitigation? Because it feels like Groundhog Day. And the tragedy is that at a time when we desperately need the economy to grow, ministers refuse to play our trump card, which is fixing our broken relationship with Europe. And that starts with getting real about the downsides. So the Liberal Democrats have a plan. So yes, we do want to seek being at the heart of Europe again. That will surprise no one. But we recognise, and I think many in this room recognise, we're nowhere near it. We have so much work that we need to do before we get to that point. So our plan has 4 steps. The first is the low-hanging fruit, the immediate action that we need to take. We heard earlier from my colleague, the MP for Twickenham, who raised the point around school children, a point echoed across the chamber today. Why on earth can't we have a bespoke scheme for school children on buses? How many of them are going to be an issue for either economy? They're just not. Let's get on with the obvious common sense things that we need to do, and that starts to rebuild that relationship. But then we need to go further in step 2. We need to seek cooperation agreements, a full return to Erasmus+, for example, but also an agreement on asylum, which would make a huge difference to one of the Prime Minister's priorities on small boats. Third, we need to negotiate greater access for our world-leading UK food and animal products to the single market, also known as a veterinary agreement. We need to secure deals on sector-specific work visas, which would benefit, in particular, the NHS, and we need to re-establish mutual recognition of professional qualifications. And finally, as has been mentioned earlier by the member for Leeds Central, yes, we should be seeking membership into the single market. And it might be the single market with the customs union. It will have changed slightly by then. We will have our own deal, but we need full, unfettered access, and that is the only thing that is going to help our small businesses and our economy in the future. And that's a future that I want to see in this country, working together, slashing red tape, boosting the economy, easing the cost of living crisis, pooling research to beat cancer, tackling international crime and trafficking, giving young people that opportunity to study where they want. And all of that is on offer. So I urge the Minister and the Government to take it.
Nicholson.
Thank you very much indeed, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mr Dowd. The historians, of course, will write in amazement about Brexit. The swagger of its proponents, the vanity, the false promises and lies, the salutary sight of focused Brussels negotiators sitting well-briefed at the negotiating table opposite a series of hapless, unbriefed Tory ministers. The laughable suggestion that other EU countries would be so envious of Brexit that they would rush to emulate it. The sage advice from our friends ignored, the Brexit enthusiasts, Trump, Farage and Putin, whose malign presence alone should have served as a warning. The campaign tinged with racism and attacks on foreigners, the misplaced triumphalism, the sheer vulgar philistinism, the disdain shown for the people of Scotland. If you're in the European Union, you can leave. But if you're in this union, your voice doesn't count. Now, I was on the BBC's debate night recently. I was up against a Scottish Tory MSP, and a member of the audience asked her what benefits she thought Brexit had brought. Do you know what she said? She said, none at all. Full marks for honesty. But the Scottish Tory press office, of course, went into meltdown, and I'm not sure she's been seen since. We all know the truth about Brexit, but we don't expect for a moment that the Tory UK government will do as today's petitioners demand. The embarrassment would be too much for this apparently unembarrassable administration. And what of my Labour friends? Alas, they are leaderless and sinking on Europe. They are now a party tethered to the anchor of a failing Brexit. Honourable exceptions, I'm talking about the party leadership. Now, I know Brexit leaders haven't suffered. Some rewarded with seats for life in the Lords as unelected legislators. Many we know having searched family histories or exploited the generosity of the Irish government for passports can skip past fellow Britons queuing long hours at EU borders. But what of our constituents who suffer from Brexit? My constituency, Oakland and South Perthshire, straddles rural and urban areas. Brexit, rejected emphatically by the Scottish electorate, has impacted every single part of it. Young people have lost access to the incredible Erasmus scheme. Previously, medical students and young social workers could go on a long work placement in Germany and bring their experience back. Students from all backgrounds could spend a year in France or Spain or Romania to improve their language skills and widen their horizons. The replacement, the so-called Turing scheme, poor Alan Turing, how sad that his name should be associated with it. Well, it promised worldwide advantages, but not for my constituent to travel to Singapore via Turing. Once there, he was told that there was no money left in the pot to fund his continued stay. He was offered no alternatives, no assistance. Typical bungling Brexit chaos. My amazing office team had to work with him to find all sorts of odd and unexpected allowances, bursaries and funds that would plug the gap. I have the oldest distillery in the country in my constituency, Glenturret. Pre-Brexit, the boss told me last week they delivered without impediment all across Europe, sharing lorries with other companies for cost and environmental reasons. Now, if any other firm on the shared transport has made the slightest paperwork mistake, all their goods collectively are sent back with export and other duties. One consignment was sent back twice. The first time as the whisky was labelled from Scotland. The second time because it was labelled from Britain. The rules we've negotiated mean that neither name is recognised. Ironic, eh? Global Britain. It takes longer, according to the whisky boss, sometimes to get whisky to Paris than to Japan. And that's not because it's becoming quicker to get to Japan. Getting to Paris has simply become a nightmare. Glenturret now has had to design new labels for every single market within the EU. 7 different labels, with all the added cost of switching the machine and switching the labels. They've had to abandon smaller markets in the Baltic states and elsewhere. Curses.
Mr. Chairman, there's going to be 2 votes, I think. Is that not right? I understand 2 votes. Do we know? 15 minutes. 15 minutes, shall we say?
in my constituency, Glentower, the distillery, and how they've had to design new labels for every market within the European Union, 7 different labels with all the added cost. They've had to abandon smaller markets in the Baltic states and elsewhere. The added costs wipe out any profits there. Then there are firms in my constituency crying out for labour. We've heard about this before. Fruit, which is rotted in fields across the country because EU workers can't get visas. My constituency hotels can't open to full capacity either for the very same reason. Now, one owner implored me to hand-deliver a letter to UK ministers. If only they knew what was happening on the ground, he said, they would do something. I said, they know. They don't care. Brexit zealots would have us living in caves if it meant delivering the pure Brexit isolation that so many of them crave. So as we wait, perhaps forever, for Brexiter Tories and a Labour front bench wearing Brexiter clothes which fit so badly, we can, I suspect, offer petitioners today little hope of a Brexit apology from Westminster. These benches, the SNP, offer the only unambiguous pro-EU vision. We want to rejoin the EU at the first possible opportunity. Scotland, independent and within the European Union, will, like our long-term ally and near neighbour Denmark, enjoy excellent access to trade. Our ancient and modern universities and networks of colleges will reconnect with thousands of institutions across the EU to share research, opportunities and students. Young people will be able once more to live, love and work across the EU as my generation did. We will thrive as part of a cooperative team of nations, small and large. And we know we've friends across the Union, the European Union. As my friend, the member for Stirling, would say, keep a light on for us. We're coming back soon.
Chair today, Mr Dowd, I'd like to place on record my thanks to constituents in Coatbridge, Christ and Bellshill who signed E-petition 628226. They did so because Brexit was sold to so many as an opportunity for the UK to take back control and become a stronger, more independent state. But today we are in no better a position in one single area of life in the United Kingdom as a result of leaving the European Union. Economy, trade, fishing, labour force, environmental standards, structural funding, inward investment, immigration, the peace process and many more have all been harmed thanks to the realities of Brexit. The Secretary of State for Business and Trade has opined recently that Tory MPs and the media should, quote, not keep talking about Brexit. Yet here we are, petitioned to debate the matter by a UK public already sick and tired of Brexit and its implications, and the reasons for being so are plentiful. Scotland's economy, we know, will be hit hardest by Brexit. Exit estimates suggest that it could result in a loss of £12.7 billion per year by 2030. Exports of goods from Scotland to the EU fell by over 11% in the first quarter of 2021 compared to that same period in the year 2020. The OBR has said that Brexit has had a, quote, significant adverse impact, unquote, on UK trade. The latest figures show that the EU's trade intensity has indeed increased since Brexit, while the UK's has fallen by 2.8%. And yet we have a UK government who are so desperately trying to convince themselves that they have the rest of the world to trade with. The depressing reality is, Mr Speaker, Mr Dowd, that the reductions in tariffs as part of a UK-Australia deal, for example, will save UK households a pathetic £1.20 per household. Not even enough to buy as much as a stick of butter with today's sky-high fuel prices, alone largely caused by Brexit itself. And an economy, let us remember, that was further recklessly decimated by the previous Tory Prime Minister incumbent and Chancellor not so long ago. They'd also like us to not keep talking about that as well, I would suggest. An analysis by the University of Sussex UK Trade Policy Observatory show that Brexit losses are more than 178 times bigger than any of these new trade deal gains. Each one of those losses being felt by communities the lead and breadth of Scotland. So what can we do about this? Well, the reality is that only full membership would restore what we had and all that we have lost, including our credibility. However, along with the Tories, the Labour Party want no part of that, being just as committed to Brexit, a hard Brexit, as the Tories in this place are. And that's regardless what a few backbench MPs have said in this debate today. The damage Brexit has caused to Scotland will be long-lasting, and it is being endorsed by the UK Labour Party. Most people in Scotland were proud Remainers, and we are now proud rejoiners, because Scotland's focus should rightly be on rejoining the European Union. And post-independence, Scotland's markets will transform and expand to be able to take advantage of an EU market 7 times larger than that of the UK. And UK Labour does not want that for Scotland. Even though their parliamentarians in Holyrood know that it's what is right, the party leaders here in England say no. Bluntly, they are willing to throw Scotland under that big red Brexit bus to get the keys to Downing Street. And the people of Coatbridge, Christen and Belsill, they don't want the same old Labour, a party that they view as a pale imitation to the Tory party today. They want those who are in touch with public opinion, who understand the impact of Brexit within and on our communities. They want those who protect and enhance their interests, not barter them off. In 2014, Labour dragged Alistair Darling and Gordon Brown out of political graves to tell Scotland that independence would threaten our membership of the European Union, would imperil people's pensions and would cause a currency crisis. Well, look where we are right now. We're out of the European Union. The UK pension plans were on the brink of collapse, and within hours last year, NHS has lost a quarter of its workforce. The cost of food is up by 18%. 4% has been knocked off our GDP, and the sterling has lost a third of its value. These are the consequences, and people are paying the price right now. Brexit has only served to decimate our economy and damage our standing on the international stage. Further hated policies of this government, such as the Nationality and Borders Bill and Rwanda policy, cause Scottish people great anguish and embarrassment, and remaining in this isolated and insular UK union is strangling Scotland's ambition and our potential. Scotland's home is unquestionably in Europe, and to coin a Labour phrase, the only road to Europe now runs through an independent Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Alan Smith.
Thank you, Mr Dowd. It's a pleasure to wind up for the SNP in this debate, and good to see you in your place. I do feel for our Minister today. He's been the thinnest of blue lines, and look forward to hearing his response too, as much as I don't necessarily have a great deal of hope for the substance of it. I do have much respect for him personally in the position he finds himself in today. I would pay tribute to the organisers of the petition and the 178,000 people who have signed it. The members for East Dunbartonshire, Ochil and South Perthshire, Coatbridge and Christen and Bellishill, and Linlithgow and East Falkirk all made very solid contributions to the debate, as did a number of colleagues from all perspectives and all points of the House, except perhaps the government benches, though we look forward to the Minister, as I say. And on brass tacks, the SNP supports this petition. We want to see evidence-based policy making. I think it's important to find out how we got to where we are if we're to plot a way forward to the solutions. But I would voice that support with a wee note of caution that I hope I can gently express some reservation over the perspective that the wording reveals. That, if I quote, the impact Brexit has had on this country and its citizens. Well, for the avoidance of doubt, my country is Scotland. The United Kingdom is not my country. The United Kingdom is a state. It is a union comprised of 4 countries. And perspective is not a synonym for a difference of opinion. We see this from a different place. Scotland has a very clear European perspective. My party is the most pro-European party in this Parliament. But I also have a particular neuralgia with the phrase, this country and its citizens. Mr Dowd, to my mind, the people who were most affected by leaving the EU in the way that we did were EU nationals, resident in these islands, who had their lives turned upside down, who had rights that they had come to these islands to live, work, study, marry into our communities. They had them taken away. and they didn't even get a vote in it. Now, I am deeply proud of my party's ethos that if you're in Scotland, you're one of us. It's not obligatory, but you're very welcome if you want to be. I am deeply proud of the fact that the Scottish Parliament has legislated to move voting eligibility in Scottish elections, the ones we control, from nationality to residence. Now, that's a queer sort of nationalism in a continental historic European sense, but Scotland's tragedy for 250 years was that we exported our people. And it was freedom of movement from the European Union that started to get it back up again. And I am deeply proud that anyone who lives in Scotland is one of us as far as the Scottish Government is concerned. That was not the case in the EU referendum. In the independence referendum in 2014, the Scottish Government quite specifically chose the European franchise for voting entitlement in order to broaden that eligibility as much as we legally could at the time. We've since broadened it further. The United Kingdom Government, despite amendments from the SNP team at that point to broaden that franchise, chose quite specifically to say 0.2 to 2.6 million people living in these islands, part of our communities, part of our families, paying taxes here. It is demonstrably true that EU immigrants pay far more taxes to the UK Exchequer than they took back in services. But the UK had a debate about your place in our community, about your position in our economy, about your role here, but you're not going to say in that because you're foreign, you're not one of us. That is a deeply ugly, exclusive politics, which I do hate. So I'm quite sure it's unintentional in the wording of the petition, but its citizens, I think, really should have a wider perspective than it does. Also, I'd like to see mention of the fact that the UK's exit from the European Union has damaged European solidarity. It's damaged sincere cooperation. It was based on an exclusive idea that somehow the UK was subjected to EU laws, which we had every part in producing. So I do support this petition, but I do have some reservations of that wording. And the SNP is the most pro-EU party in this Parliament. My position, Mr Dowd, in the front bench is as Europe and EU accession spokesperson, very deliberately, because our mission is to get an independent Scotland back into the European Union. We have a clear constitutional agenda. And as that independent state in the European Union, I believe we'll thrive. But it's really important, I say, to a UK audience and the European campaigns that exist in every community up and down these islands. The SNP simultaneously, at the same time, wants to see the UK do well. I don't want to see the UK have a bad time. I believe that the UK should be as close to, if not part of, the EU as possible, in all its programmes, in all its forms. I want to see the UK have a functioning relationship that secures peace in Northern Ireland, that secures trade, that secures the research-intensive industrial policy that the EU has that the UK should be part of, but presently risks losing. The UK is going to be our closest friend and our closest market, and vice versa. I want to see the UK do well. If you don't believe that, it will also make our independence project easier, because the EU we seek to join will have that deep and close relationship with the UK, I hope. It's not just for its own sake. But I have been struck through this debate, Mr Dowd, that some of the contributions were frankly a little backward-looking. How one's constituency voted, I think, isn't relevant anymore for all of us. Now, Scotland voted massively to remain. Of course we did. That's a matter of fact. The UK as a whole voted to leave. That's also a fact. So I think we need to talk about the democratic deficit implicit within the UK right now, which is demonstrated by the fact that Scotland was removed against our will from the European Union. Now, that's not the battles of the past. That's the discussions of the future. And I think a backward-looking attitude to this actually impedes us from finding solutions to the problems we're now experiencing. I've said repeatedly in debates in this House, I want to see the UK have a close relationship with the EU, and I will work towards that with anyone who wants to do so. And I think the Windsor framework, which I will pay tribute to, is a pragmatic step in that sort of direction. And let's, for goodness sake, see more of that rather than backward-looking attitudes. I'm also, for the avoidance of doubt, not interested in rerunning the EU referendum. That was a long time ago. The world's changed. I'm not interested in overturning the result. I respect everyone who voted leave, wherever they voted leave, for whatever reason. And I think people who voted leave were entitled to believe the promises that were made to them. They were entitled to believe the good faith of the politicians and others who made those promises. But the reality, frankly, Mr Dowd, is that the promises that were made have not been delivered. Now, there may be reasons why they've not been delivered, but that's why I think an inquiry would be useful in ventilating that. Now, who can forget the greatest hits? There will be no downside, only a considerable upside. Nobody is talking about leaving the single market. Of course, we'll keep Erasmus. We hold all the cards. All of those things, and 350 million a week for the NHS. Who wouldn't vote for that? It's remarkable it wasn't higher result. So that is what I think needs to be ventilated, Mr Dowd, and that's why I support this petition in its aims, because the vote was presented essentially as a risk-free, consequence-free vote. Everything you like, you'll keep. Everything you don't like or don't understand will recede from your life. Well, the reality has been really very different. I'd also, and I would expand the scope of the inquiry the petition seeks to have into the techniques that the Leave campaign used. Because I'm concerned that we have an ongoing vulnerability to such recklessness. I'd like to see a proper review of electoral law, data protection, campaign financing, particularly the role of dark money, the remarkable lack of a single Leave campaign manifesto to hold the Leave campaign to account. A variety of promises were made, some in good faith, some perhaps less so, but they've not been delivered. We also need a proper look at the powers of the Electoral Commission and the role of broadcasters and internet providers in public information in future campaigns, because I think we do have an ongoing vulnerability to recklessness, let's call it that. So we support this petition, but I would caution an inquiry of this sort will deliver a degree of truth if it happens, and I'd have to say it's at the top end of expectation that it might. But the people out there need answers, they need progress, they need solutions right now. I think we should establish truth. I think that's a good thing to do in and of itself. I think we should ensure we fix any future vulnerabilities, ongoing vulnerabilities, but people need answers now. And I'm not interested in a blame game. So the people who are struggling in my district in Stirling, an area bigger than Luxembourg, the heart of Scotland, we're suffering right now of the consequences of leaving the European Union. My farmers can't get their crops planted and can't get them harvested either. We have a crippling agricultural labour shortage. We have a crippling hospitality shortage as well, which is deeply relevant to my community. The NHS is short of staff. Creative touring people are also struggling. We have a lively music scene. And young people on student exchanges are finding it more difficult, more complicated, and more expensive. So let's have specific sectoral visas for that freedom of movement in and out of individual sectors to give them solutions right now that will actually solve these problems. To universities up and down Scotland and the UK suffering about the uncertainty over continued engagement in Horizon Europe, let's join Horizon Europe. It is on the table in Brussels right now. The Windsor framework has gone away to building that trust. Let's build it further in everybody's mutual advantage. I'm not talking about reversing Brexit. I'm talking about dealing with the problems that we have right now. For our food importers and exporters, we need a veterinary agreement to make sure that the flow across the borders is as frictionless as it can be. And for our SMEs, we need single market membership to remove the barriers that have been put up by the recent events that we've suffered. So the SNP supports this petition. The SNP supports EU membership for Scotland as an independent state, but we also want to see the UK have a close relationship with the EU, because that'll go away not to apportion blame for how we got here, but to actually fix the problems that we're all experiencing. I view that as a common endeavour, and I'll engage with anybody from all points of the compass to see that happen. But we support this petition, Mr Dowd, and I look forward to hearing our Minister's response about it. Thank you.
Mr Dowd, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship and also that of Mr McCabe before. And can I thank the Honourable Member for Linlithgow and East Falkirk for presenting the petition today, and to acknowledge the over 180,000 people who've signed the petition, including a number in my own constituency. And I'm profoundly aware that this is an area on which there are passionately and sincerely held views, and I want to thank colleagues from across the House today for their contributions to today's debate, although I would note the stark absence, with one exception, of Conservatives here who are clearly not willing to defend their record. And in contrast, we in Labour will not shy away from engaging constructively in debates surrounding the impact of the government's handling of Brexit on people, communities and businesses across the UK. And indeed, many impacts have rightly been highlighted and exposed today, including my honourable friends from Hornsey and Wood Green, Gower, Battersea, Putney, Walthamstow, my right honourable friend from Leeds Central, and indeed my friend from Leeds North West. And we want to focus, Mr Dowd, on one of the most important tasks today, making our relationship with the EU work, growing our economy, defending our security and tackling common challenges from energy to climate change. We will not seek to rejoin the EU, the single market or the customs union, but it is imperative that we make our future relationship with the EU work, we fix the holes in the government's deal, and we deliver stability, trust and mutual benefit in our relationships with partners across Europe, both in and out of the EU, and in making use of new forums such as the EPC. Indeed, I had fruitful discussions today with friends from Norway, as I know the Minister did too. And I must say from the outset, we do not believe that expanding scarce financial resources on a public inquiry that would take years to complete would be the right step forward. We already expose the many impacts and failures in the government's policy in this area in this place on a weekly basis, and this is a topic that should rightly be the focus of robust democratic parliamentary scrutiny, as we've seen today, whether or not we agree with all of the points that have been made. But I would far rather see millions that could be spent on an inquiry instead used in practically addressing some of the very many flaws and holes that we've seen exposed today. And this is, of course, not just about cost. It's about bringing people together and looking forward rather than dividing them once again by looking back. We are now almost 7 years on from the referendum, and the world and our country have both changed considerably since the day of that vote, and the impact of our departure from the EU is, of course, a contributing factor as to where we stand today. Indeed, there is a consensus among economists that the government's poorly negotiated deal with the EU, compounded by 13 years of economic stagnation, has contributed to the UK lagging, as we've heard today, behind the rest of the G7. And for 7 years now, we've watched the government pick fights with our closest European allies, allowing dogma to override pragmatism. And all the while, we've seen investment down, growth sluggish, 45% of businesses saying that they have difficulties trading with the EU, exports down a third, as we've heard. We've seen an approach that has often left us isolated, less secure and stuck in the binaries of the past, at a time when cooperation was needed more than ever, on security when we face war in Europe, on energy when we face an energy price crisis and the challenge of climate change, and on economic cooperation as we face inflation, the cost of living crisis and the challenge of responding to geopolitical competition and threats to the resiliency of our supply chains. We would completely change the tone and tenor of our relationship with the EU and form the basis for an ambitious partnership based on common interests and mutual respect. Clear about our position outside the EU, but optimistic about what we can do together in a critical strategic partnership. And fundamentally, this is something the party opposite are inherently incapable of delivering. Let's take the retained EU law bill, for example. The party opposite now doubling down to appease hardline fringes by introducing an irresponsible piece of legislation that will only prolong uncertainty for businesses nationwide, opposed by business organisations, trade unions and environmental groups, undermining the proper role of Parliament and handing ministers, as we've heard, yet more unaccountable powers, placing hard-won rights at work, environmental standards, consumer protections at the whim of power-hungry ministers. And quite frankly, we do not need an inquiry to tell us this is a grave error or to expose the wider impacts of Tory Brexit policy more widely. Across the country today, the questions people are asking are, how do I pay the bills? How do I secure cheaper and greener energy? How do I put food on the table when prices are going up? What jobs and opportunities are there for my children? How do we keep our country safe? We don't need an inquiry to answer those questions. We need a Labour UK government. And Labour has a clear plan to make our relationship with Europe work and to address the broader concerns that have been raised in the context of this petition. Keir Starmer, the member for Holborn and St Pancras, has set out a clear plan to secure this. Of course, securing a deal on the Northern Ireland Protocol, which we called for and then supported, tearing down unnecessary trade barriers, supporting world-leading services and scientists, keeping Britain safe and investing in Britain. So looking forward, not back, let me just touch on some of those and address some of the issues that have been raised in the debate today. Let me start with trade, Mr Dowd. Let's be frank, this government has no clear trade strategy, and it's little wonder that OBR forecasts that UK exports are due to fall by 6.6% this year, which is worth more than a 51 billion hit to the UK economy. The last manifesto of the government promised by the end of 2022, 80% of UK trade would be covered by free trade agreements, including an agreement with the US, Mr Dowd. But the reality now is these deals are far from complete. And indeed, the UK's trade deficit with the EU widened to a record high in the final quarter of 2022 as imports from the bloc jumped. The shortfall in the balance of the trading goods ballooned to 32.9 billion in the 3 months to December, the largest gap since records began in 1997. And the trade barriers put in place by the Tory Brexit deal are accentuating the economic burden being shouldered by our businesses and constituents, and tearing them down would be a priority for a Labour government. Outside of the single market and the customs union, we need to be candid and frank. We will not be able to deliver completely frictionless trade with the EU, but there are things that we can do to make trade easier, and we've heard many of them today. We should build on the very positive elements in the Windsor Framework, for example, and one of those, of course, would be expanding agri-food and veterinary agreements to cover all of the UK, seeking to build on agreements and mechanisms already in place between the EU and other countries, to negotiate a long-term deal for UK hauliers to ease the supply chain problems holding us back, putting forward a supply chain working group within the G7, using the 2025 TCA review to increase the UK's prosperity, agreeing mutual recognition of conformity assessments across specified sectors so that our producers no longer need to complete 2 sets of tests or 2 processes of certification, seeking the mutual recognition of professional qualifications to bolster our world-leading services industry and sorting out data adequacy to allow our digital services companies to properly compete. And whilst we do not support the return of freedom of movement, we will seek to find flexible labour mobility arrangements for those making short-term work trips, and particularly, as been mentioned by a number of colleagues today, musicians and artists seeking short-term visas to tour within the EU. On science and research, I want to discuss the opportunity that has been squandered by the Tory government, and we've heard this time and time again in the debate today. Many of our constituents feel that departure from the EU has restricted them from pursuing opportunities in terms of education and employment they would have otherwise had access to. And of course, departure from the EU did not need to mean an end to Erasmus Plus or indeed to Horizon. I recently met representatives of universities of Wales who told me that as a triple whammy, the impact of Horizon at the end of the European structural funds and of course the failure to replace Horizon has meant that 1,000 jobs are now at risk in crucial universities, high-tech, high-skilled jobs across Wales. The Conservatives made a manifesto promise that they would associate with Horizon. They've repeated that 50 times since, and yet we've seen instead years of delay and uncertainty with jobs, projects and inward investment lost, and still no deal despite the resolution of issues around the Northern Ireland Protocol. We would unblock the UK's participation in Horizon and bring about the cooperation we need when it comes to science, technology, education and skills across the UK and in key regions and, of course, our nations. And finally, Mr Dowd, I want to turn to security. Strong and smart British foreign policy has always started with secure alliances in Europe. But since 2016, our relations with Europe have been characterised by bluster, bombast and brinkmanship by the party opposite at a time when the security of our country has faced some of its most severe threats. We would negotiate a UK-EU security pact which would be predicated on the defence of democracy and ensuring, with NATO as our bedrock, that we also seek close cooperation and coordination with our European allies on foreign, defence, development and security policy, whether on sanctions, our energy resilience, our support for Ukraine, our coordination on cross-border crime, our efforts against terrorism, our response to instability in our own continent and near neighbourhood, or indeed in our approach to China. We could have had a security pact when we left the EU, but the Tories failed to agree one. And we would seek arrangements to share data, intelligence where appropriate, and best practice with our closest allies. Mr Dowd, in conclusion, I want to express that I understand calls from many of the petitioners for a rigorous assessment into this government's failings when it comes to the Brexit deal that they secured and the impact that it's had on this country. We will not shirk away on this side from addressing those failings or denying their existence. But I do believe that relitigating old arguments does not build a plan on which to base the future or to set a new course for an ambitious partnership with our closest neighbours and allies in Europe. We on this side have a plan to move the country forward, resetting our relationship with the European Union and taking common sense and practical steps to redefine this relationship to withstand the challenges of the present and indeed of the years and decades to come.
Thank you. Thank you. Minister.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Dowd. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship this afternoon. I'm very grateful to the honourable member for Lithgow and for East Falkirk for securing this debate, and very grateful for the contributions of all honourable and right honourable members. And it's been a very interesting and thought-provoking debate, and I will seek to cover off the main points raised in my remarks. So, Mr Dowd, let me begin by saying the UK and the EU are still hugely important allies. We're trading partners and we are old friends, and we've left the European Union, but we have not left Europe. And we want our friends to thrive, and I know from my personal visits on a personal basis and many ministerial visits that they wish the same for us. And we must respect, therefore, the democratic decision of our own people. The UK's departure from the EU was the result, as has been described today, of a democratic choice by the people across the nation to restore our sovereignty. And I pay tribute to the very eloquent speech made by the Honourable Member for Gravesham. In 2015, the government was elected with a mandate to hold a referendum. In that referendum, the British public voted to leave the EU. And we must remember, Mr Dowell, that the government has since been re-elected twice with a very clear mandate to pass the necessary legislation to leave the EU and negotiate a trade agreement. And the resounding endorsement of that proposition in 2019 with a very significant majority is a case in point. Now, of course, Parliament approved the withdrawal agreement, the terms for the UK's withdrawal from the EU in January 2020 and the Trade and Cooperation Agreement thereafter in December of the same year. And the government's policies, therefore, on our new relationship with the EU are subject to robust parliamentary scrutiny. We have agreed arrangements with the European Scrutiny Committee, the European Affairs Committee and its subcommittee on the Protocol on Northern Ireland and Northern Ireland. We have regular and extensive correspondence with these committees, of which I'm personally familiar. And under the terms of the arrangement, ministers must regularly appear before them. Indeed, I appeared before the European Affairs Committee on 7th of March. And the Foreign Secretary will appear in front of the Northern Ireland Protocol Subcommittee on 10th of May. And of course, we're grateful for those committees for their ongoing scrutiny. Both the European Scrutiny Committee and the European Affairs Committee are currently holding inquiries into the new UK-EU relationship, to which the government has provided evidence that can be read online. And these inquiries will be published in due course. Now, for all of those reasons, Mr Dowd, the government really does not believe that it would be appropriate to hold an inquiry into the impact of Brexit. So let me just dwell on the theme of seizing the opportunities of Brexit, which has been a subject raised this afternoon. Of course, restoring our sovereignty was just the start of what the British public voted for in the referendum. Britain left the EU to do things differently and to make her own laws. But this was not just political theory. Our laws, our tax framework, and the way we spend our money all make a real difference to people's lives. And the government is committed to capitalising on the opportunities of Brexit, which is why it intends to end retained EU law as a legal category by December 2023. Now, this will make sure that the UK's rules and regulations best serve the interests of our country as a whole and support workers and businesses to build a thriving economy. I'm delighted to give way.
He's talked there very passionately about parliamentary sovereignty, and he's raised the retained EU law bill. And whatever the whys and wherefores of how we thought the European Union listened to the UK public through its democratic processes, can he explain to us why transferring direct power over 5,000 areas of legislation, not to this place, but to ministers through the use of SIs or Henry VIII powers, as we might call them, is taking back control? Because I see the opposition to these measures from those who supported Brexit in the other place, from in this place. And it doesn't look to me like it does what it said on the back of a bus.
Well, the retained EU law bill will be yet another expression of our renewed democratic sovereignty, and her constituents should be reassured by that, because it is colleagues in this House who will decide which laws stand, which are absorbed, and which are repealed. And she should be reassured by this more direct expression of our democratic sovereignty. Now, Mr Dowd, a range, therefore, of major reforms are already underway, including to data protection, artificial intelligence and life sciences regimes. We are capitalising on our newfound freedoms outside of the EU to attract investment, drive innovation and boost growth. And we announced the Edinburgh reforms very recently to drive growth and competitiveness in the financial services sector. But, of course, laws will not be abolished for the sake of it. We will not jeopardise our strong record on workers' rights, for example, which is among the best in the world. Neither will we roll back maternity rights or threaten the high environmental standards we maintain. Now, turning to trade, Mr Dowd, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the TCA, that was agreed in 2020 is worth, and it's worth remembering that this is the world's largest zero tariffs and zero quotas deal. This is the first time ever the EU has agreed access like this in a free trade agreement. And the TCA also guards the right of both the EU and the UK to determine their own policies while not regressing in ways that affect trade between the two sides. And the UK remains committed to being a global leader in these areas. As the Office for National Statistics has previously noted, there are a number of factors, of course, beyond Brexit that have influenced global trading patterns most recently, especially including the war in Ukraine, global economic forces, and continued strain on supply chains. But despite this, we must remember that the UK remains a very attractive place to invest and grow a business as a low-tax, high-skilled economy. And I'd be delighted to give way.
When he stated yet again, you know, the pandemic, the war, but can he then explain why is it that we are languishing at the bottom of the league table of growing economies for developed countries behind Russia? All of those countries are facing the same thing, and yet we're at the bottom. Why could that possibly be?
Well, she should take encouragement from the fact that if you look to FDI investment, for example, the foreign direct investment stock in the UK increased from $2.2 trillion in 2020 to $2.6 trillion in 2021. This is the highest foreign direct investment stock in Europe and second highest in the world, only behind the United States, and up from our ranking in 2020. So that's just one measure of the expression of confidence in the future. Now, of course, there have been headwinds, but taken in the round, the economic future is one of a terrific dynamism and confidence of the UK. And she should share that confidence. She should be confident in the future prospects of the British economy. And outside the EU, Mr. Dow, we are creating the best regulatory environment to drive economic growth and develop a competitive advantage in new and future technologies where terrific growth lies. From artificial intelligence and gene editing to the future of transport and data protection, we are building a pro-growth, high-standard framework that gives business the capacity and the confidence to innovate, invest and create jobs. And, of course, I'll give way.
The Minister's talking about innovation and future technologies. We will have heard members from all sides today raise concerns about the lack of funding that's now going to come from being outside of Horizon. And even if a new deal is agreed, that is going to be a significant period away. Does he think that the challenges being faced by our university sector will boost growth, innovation and investment, or reduce them?
Well, I foresee a future where we have a very dynamic innovation sector, supported by the government, but working in partnership with our European friends. I won't give a running commentary on our negotiations with regard to the Horizon programme, but colleagues will know that negotiations are underway. And our approach is one of buoyant confidence about the benefits of future cooperation. That is all I'll say. But I hope my honourable friend shares my confidence. Now, Mr. Dow, we must also remember the Chancellor's work on financial services, to give another example, will see over 30 regulatory reforms unlock investment and turbocharge growth across the UK. A new approach to regulation will make meaningful change for the British public with faster access, for example, to new medical treatments. Delighted to give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way. Referring to the confidence expressed in the business environment created by Brexit, it's been reported today that the number of UK chief executives quitting their jobs has more than doubled as bosses battle sluggish growth and a nightmare of EU red tape. The number of chief executives left their role jumped by 111%. Would the Minister agree that the business environment created by Brexit hasn't been entirely jubilant?
Of course, there have been choppy waters in recent times. I haven't denied that. But my proposition is that, taken in the round, the future growth of this country is clear to see, and she should share our confidence in our ability to be an agile and global and extremely dynamic economy, which no doubt we will be. Now, let me just make some comments about immigration. Because, Mr. Dow, Brexit has also allowed us to move to a much fairer immigration system. The government has introduced a points-based system to attract top talent from around the world, while at the same time activating the enormous potential of the UK workforce. And this global points-based immigration system is focused on talent and skills, not where someone comes from. And it makes it easier for the brightest and best to live and work in the UK. And we've already introduced a comprehensive suite of new work routes, and we continue to welcome and retain thousands of valuable and talented workers, scientists, researchers, doctors, nurses, engineers, bricklayers and plumbers. Of course, the points-based system is attracting worldwide talent and skills, including from EU member states, and we're very grateful for it. Turning now to EU-UK cultural exchanges, of course, colleagues will agree that Brexit was never about the UK stepping away from our proud and historic role in Europe. We continue to support cultural exchanges between the UK and the EU, like the Turing Scheme, which allows UK educational organisations to fund life-changing experiences around the world. And we do everything we can to facilitate the high flow rate of school children in both directions into the future. Now, in terms of our relationship with the EU, the government is now fully focused on implementing the Trade and Cooperation Agreement and the newly agreed Windsor Framework. Both the withdrawal agreement and the TCA are functioning as intended. We now look forward to entering a new phase in our post-Brexit relationships in Europe. And as we set out in our recent refresh of the integrated review, the UK is committed to upholding the stability, security and prosperity of our continent and the Euro-Atlantic as a whole. And it's our ambition to build even stronger relationships with our European partners based on values, reciprocity and cooperation across our shared interests. And we will provide leadership where we are best placed to do so. We will continue to work very closely in areas of mutual benefit, as we have done so in our response to Ukraine. And we are much looking forward to hosting partners from across Europe, including EU member states, at the European Political Community meeting that we will host here in the UK in July 2024. So, Mr Dowd, allow me once again to thank all honourable and right honourable members for their contributions to this debate today. This government will continue to seize the benefits of Brexit, delivering on our manifesto commitments to the British people, and we will work closely with our European neighbours, both in the EU and beyond, to uphold our shared values of inclusion, freedom, prosperity and democracy. Thank you very much indeed. I thought that was bloody good.
Mr Dowd, on behalf of the Petitions Committee, may I extend my gratitude for all the members who gave up their time to take part in today's debate. It has been a very lively and informed debate, albeit rather one-sided. However, I think it does emphasise the strength of feeling that there is, and there was a poll which was mentioned earlier in the debate by Omnisus, which suggests 59% of the public agree that there should be an inquiry. And why shouldn't there be an inquiry into what has been the largest constitutional change this country has seen in my lifetime, the biggest economic impact? Clearly it cries out for one. I said during the debate myself that Brexit has been an unmitigated disaster, and I've heard nothing today to change my mind from that. However, it is perhaps worth pointing out that the petitioner's call is for a public inquiry, not to immediately rejoin the European Union. Now, my personal view is I want to be back in Europe as quickly as possible. I'd like to see the UK back in Europe, but I know that with Scotland we have an alternate route through independence to get there, and I'll be happy to grasp that route as quickly as we possibly can. The data that we've heard points a very bleak picture. There is simply no such thing as a good Brexit. The public increasingly can see that, and it makes me wonder if perhaps the reason that the ministers are hiding behind the democratic mandate is that they know that themselves, and that a public inquiry would highlight just the tissue of falsehoods and misinformation that the whole Brexit project was built upon. But I do think that it still requires a public inquiry, and indeed since we've been debating, the number of signatures has risen rapidly, and there's now over 184,000 people have signed the petition, and it is still growing. Thank you very much.
The question is that this House has considered E-petition 628-226 relating to the impact of the UK's exit from the European Union. As many as of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting stands adjourned.
proceeding has ended. The 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 proceeding has ended.